Picture this. It's the 16th century, and you're strolling through the bustling streets of Istanbul, back when it was Constantinople, the glittering jewel of the Ottoman Empire. The sun's beating down, the minarets are piercing the sky, and the air's thick with the scent of roasted lamb, incense, and a faint whiff of existential dread. This city's a melting pot. Greeks, Turks, Armenians, Jews, all rubbing shoulders, haggling over figs and trying not to trip over the stray cats that own the place. But beneath the vibrant chaos, there's a shadow world, one where women, and sometimes men, navigate a life that's equal parts hustle, heartbreak, and sheer audacity. Welcome to the world of Ottoman prostitutes, where survival meant mastering the art of charm, dodging the morality police, and occasionally bribing someone with a really good baklava recipe. Let's peel back the velvet curtain and step into their story. A tale so wild, it makes a soap opera look like a tax audit. First off, let's set the stage. The Ottoman Empire was a sprawling beast, stretching from the sands of North Africa to the gates of Vienna. It was a place where power, wealth, and religion collided like a camel caravan in a sandstorm. At the top, you had the Sultan, living it up in the Topkapi Palace, surrounded by his harem of concubines who were technically not prostitutes, but, let's be real, weren't exactly there for the intellectual conversation. Below them, the empire was a labyrinth of social classes, merchants, artisans, soldiers, and peasants, all trying to claw their way up or at least not fall into the abyss. And then, at the edges of society, were the prostitutes. These weren't just women in seedy corners. They were part of a complex, shadowy economy that thrived in the cracks of this glittering empire. They were the ultimate survivors, playing a high-stakes game where the rules were written by men, enforced by religion, and broken by sheer necessity. So, who were these women? Well, they weren't all cut from the same cloth, or lack thereof. Some were locals, born and bred in the empire's cities or villages, pushed into the trade by poverty, widowhood, or a family that decided daughters were less useful than goats. Others were foreigners, captives from war, enslaved women from the Balkans, or even adventurous souls who ended up in Istanbul after a series of bad life choices. Picture a young woman named Zeynep, maybe 19, from a dusty village in Anatolia. Her father's dead, her brother's off fighting for the Sultan, and her mother's got 6 other mouths to feed. Zeynep's got 2 options: marry a 60-year-old farmer with a temper, or head to the city and take her chances. Spoiler alert, the city wins. But Istanbul's no fairy tale. It's a jungle of cobblestone streets, crooked officials, and clients who think payment means a half-eaten kebab. Zeynep's story isn't unique. It's the grim refrain of thousands who found themselves in the oldest profession, not because they dreamed of it, but because the alternative was starvation. Now, let's talk about where this all went down. Istanbul was the beating heart of the empire, and its red light districts were as lively as the Grand Bazaar. Areas like Galata, with its narrow alleys and taverns packed with sailors, were basically the Vegas of the Ottoman world. Picture dimly lit rooms, the clink of coins, and the murmur of negotiations in a dozen languages. These weren't just back alley deals. Prostitution was semi-organized, with brothels operating under the watchful eye of the state, sort of. The Ottoman government had a love-hate relationship with the trade. On one hand, they taxed it because nothing says empire like squeezing money out of misery. On the other, they had to keep up appearances for the religious crowd, who weren't exactly thrilled about sin being a taxable asset. So, brothels were tolerated in certain neighborhoods, but every so often, the authorities would swoop in for a moral cleanup, shutting down houses and sending everyone scattering like roaches when the lanterns lit. What's wild is how these women operated in a society obsessed with honor and shame. The Ottomans loved their rules: veils, segregation, no eye contact unless you're married or related. Yet, prostitutes were out here breaking every single one, and somehow they made it work. They had to be clever, though. You couldn't just hang a neon sign saying "open for business." Instead, they used subtle signals, maybe a certain type of scarf, a lingering glance at the market, or a well-placed whisper in the right ear. Some worked out of hammams, the public bathhouses where women could mingle without raising too many eyebrows. Others relied on middlemen, pimps if we're being blunt, who'd arrange clients for a cut of the profits. These guys were the ultimate middle managers, complete with the charm of a used car salesman and the ethics of a vulture. But let's not romanticize this. Life as a prostitute in the Ottoman Empire was brutal. You were at the mercy of clients who could be drunk, violent, or both. Disease was a constant shadow. Syphilis didn't exactly come with a health plan. And the law? Oh, the law was a fickle friend. If you got caught during one of those moral crackdowns, you could be fined, whipped, or exiled to some godforsaken corner of the empire. Even worse, you had to deal with the neighbors. Ottoman society was tight-knit and gossip spread faster than wildfire. Your landlord might turn a blind eye for the right price, but the baker down the street? He's telling everyone you're the reason the crops failed. Zainab, our imaginary friend, probably spent half her energy dodging judgmental stares, and the other half trying not to get robbed by her own clients. Yet, there's an absurd irony here. These women, despite being shunned, were woven into the fabric of the empire. They served soldiers, merchants, even the occasional poet who thought he was Casanova. They were the open secret everyone pretended not to see. In some of them, they were absolute hustlers. Take the story of a woman we'll call Fatma, who reportedly ran her own brothel in Galata. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving, bribing officials, charming clients, and probably keeping a ledger sharper than a sultan's scribe. Fatma's the kind of woman who'd sell you a sob story, pocket your gold, and then sell the same story to the next guy. You have to admire the hustle, even if it came with a side of moral ambiguity. Let's zoom out for a second. The Ottoman Empire wasn't just about Istanbul. Prostitution was everywhere. Ankara, Damascus, Cairo. Each city had its own flavor of the trade. In Cairo, for example, the Nile was practically a highway for clients, with boats doubling as floating brothels. In smaller towns, things were less formal, more like a neighborly agreement where everyone pretended it wasn't happening. But no matter where you were, the game was the same. Stay sharp, stay alive, and maybe, just maybe, save enough to buy your way out. Most didn't. The system was rigged. Taxes, bribes, and the cost of staying presentable ate up whatever you earned. Plus, aging wasn't exactly kind in a job where youth was your main asset. So why does this matter? Because these women weren't just footnotes in history. They were the unsung anti-heroes of their time, navigating a world that stacked the deck against them. They faced violence and a disease and scorn, yet they kept going, carving out a living in a society that preached piety while turning a blind eye to its own vices. It's a story of resilience, absurdity, and the kind of dark humor you develop when life hands you nothing but lemons and expects you to make wine. So, drop a comment below. Tell me, what's the wildest survival story you've heard from history? And if you're loving this dive into the Ottoman underbelly, let me know what other dark corners of the past you want to explore. This is just part 1, folks. We've got 3 more to go, and trust me, it gets even wilder. Stick around, and let's keep unraveling this messy, magnificent tapestry of human survival. Let's pick up where we left off in the smoky, scheming underbelly of the Ottoman Empire. Istanbul is still buzzing like a beehive on fire, and our cast of characters, women like Zainab and Fatma, are dodging the law, charming the socks off merchants, and trying not to trip over society's double standards. Last time, we set the scene. A sprawling empire, a city bursting at the seams, and a trade that thrived in the shadows despite everyone pretending it didn't exist. Now, let's zoom in on the daily grind of these women, the absurdities they faced, and the sheer audacity it took to survive in a world that loved to judge but never missed a chance to profit. Imagine waking up as Zainab, our young hustler from Anatolia. Your office is a cramped room in Galata with a straw mattress that's seen better days and a curtain that's more holes than fabric. The rent's due, the landlord's a creep, and your neighbor's already whispering about your sinful ways to anyone who'll listen. Breakfast? Maybe a chunk of bread and some watered-down yogurt if you're lucky. Your day starts with a mental checklist. Avoid the religious police. Don't trust the guy who promised to pay next time. And maybe, just maybe, charm someone into leaving a tip bigger than a single coin. This isn't glamour. This is survival with a side of sass. Because if you don't laugh at the absurdity, you'll cry at the reality. The Ottoman world was obsessed with order. Men and women were segregated, veils were mandatory, and honor was the currency of social status. Yet prostitutes like Zainab were the ultimate rule breakers, existing in a weird gray zone where they were both despised and indispensable. The empire's economy leaned on them, whether anyone admitted it or not. Brothels paid taxes. Yes, the Sultan's tax collectors were happy to take a cut of sin as long as the paperwork was in order. In Istanbul, neighborhoods like Galata and Üsküdar had entire streets where the trade was an open secret. These weren't just random hovels. Some brothels were proper businesses, complete with madams who ran the show like cutthroat CEOs. Think Fatma, our entrepreneurial queen from part 1, who probably had a better head for numbers than half the Sultan's advisors. But here's the kicker. The same society that taxed these women also loved to punish them. The Ottoman legal system was a bizarre mix of Islamic law, imperial decrees, and whatever the local judge had for breakfast. Prostitution wasn't explicitly illegal, because let's face it, banning it would have meant admitting it existed, but it was heavily regulated. Brothels had to operate in designated areas, and woe to you if you stepped out of line. Get caught soliciting in the wrong neighborhood? That's a fine. Annoy the wrong official? You're on a one-way trip to exile in some backwater village where the only clients are goats. And then there were the moral purges, when the Sultan or some overzealous cleric decided it was time to cleanse the city. Picture Zainab sprinting through the alleys, hiding from the morality police while clutching her earnings and praying her scarf doesn't slip. It's like a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek, except losing means a public whipping or worse. Let's talk about the clients, because they're half the story. These weren't just lonely sailors or shady merchants, though there were plenty of those. You had everyone from poets waxing lyrical about love to soldiers fresh off the battlefield, looking to blow their pay on something other than bad wine. Some clients were regulars, forming weirdly transactional relationships with their favorites. Others were one-off disasters, guys who thought they could haggle the price down to a handful of figs, or, worse, skip payment entirely. Zainab's probably got a mental blacklist longer than a sultan scroll, with names like Mustafa the cheapskate and Ahmed who smells like onions. And let's not forget the foreigners, Venetian traders, Persian diplomats, even the occasional European traveler who thought he was living out some exotic fantasy. These guys brought coin, but also chaos, because nothing screams diplomatic incident like a drunk ambassador caught in a brothel raid. Now, let's get to the absurdities, because the Ottoman world was nothing if not a theater of the ridiculous. Take the hammams, those steamy bathhouses where women could socialize without men breathing down their necks. Sounds innocent, right? Wrong. These were prime spots for clandestine deals. A woman like Zainab might slip into a hammam, strike up a conversation with a wealthy widow, and boom, next thing you know, she's got a high-paying client lined up for the evening. The hammam was like LinkedIn for the 16th century, except instead of networking for a job, you're networking for survival. And the dress code? Oh, it was a masterclass in coded signals. A certain way of tying a scarf, a specific shade of henna on your hands. These were the Ottoman equivalent of a Tinder profile. Subtle, but unmistakable to those in the know. But the real absurdity was the social tightrope these women walked. Ottoman society was built on reputation, and prostitutes were at the bottom of the heap, yet they had to act like they belonged. They couldn't afford to look too desperate, or they'd scare off clients. They couldn't look too flashy, or they'd attract the wrong kind of attention. It was a constant performance, like being an actor in a play where the audience might stone you if they don't like the ending. And the community? They were the worst. Neighbors would smile to your face while reporting you to the authorities behind your back. The local imam might preach fire and brimstone on Friday, but slip through your door on Saturday. Hypocrisy was the glue holding the society together, and prostitutes were the ones caught in the middle, dodging the fallout with a smirk and a shrug. Disease was another grim reality. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and a host of other uninvited guests were as common as fleas in a bazaar. There were no antibiotics, no clinics, just herbal remedies that worked about as well as a prayer in a sandstorm. If you got sick, you were done. Clients wouldn't touch you, and good luck finding a doctor who'd treat a fallen woman. Zainab's probably got a stash of dubious potions under her bed, bought from a sketchy apothecary who swore they'd cure anything. Spoiler, they didn't, and pregnancy, that was a whole other nightmare. No birth control, no maternity leave, just a ticking clock in a society that'd shun you and your child faster than you can say illegitimate. Some women managed to pass their kids off to relatives or convents, but others weren't so lucky. The streets were full of stories that ended in tragedy, and nobody was writing them down. Yet, amidst the gloom, there were glimmers of defiance. Some prostitutes were absolute legends at gaming the system. Take a woman we'll call Aisha, who reportedly worked her way up from street hustler to mistress of a wealthy merchant. She didn't just survive, she played the long game. using her earnings to buy property and flip the script on the men who thought they owned her. Aisha's the kind of person who'd look at the Ottoman patriarchy and say, "Hold my coffee, I've got this." Then there were the women who formed their own networks, secret sisterhoods where they shared tips, warned each other about bad clients, and occasionally pooled their money to bribe an official or two. These weren't just acts of survival, they were acts of rebellion, proof that even in the darkest corners, people find ways to fight back. Let's not forget the cultural backdrop. The Ottoman Empire was a place where poetry, art, and music flourished, and believe it or not, prostitutes were part of that scene. Some were known for their wit, their beauty, or even their singing, turning their rooms into salons where men didn't just come for the obvious. These women were the influencers of their day, shaping trends and gossip while the elite pretended not to notice. Imagine Zainab after a long night, strumming a lute and reciting a poem that's half seduction, half shade thrown at her last client. It's the kind of dark humor that kept her sane, a way of saying, "Yeah, this is my life, but I'm still calling the shots." So, what's the takeaway? The world of Ottoman prostitutes was a brutal, absurd, and strangely vibrant place. These women weren't just victims, they were strategists, performers, and survivors in a game where the odds were stacked against them. They navigated a society that preached virtue while profiting from vice, and they did it with a mix of grit, charm, and the occasional well-timed bribe. Drop a comment below. What's the most outrageous double standard you've ever seen, historical or modern? And if you're hooked on this wild ride through the Ottoman underbelly, stick around for part 3, where we'll dig into the scandals, the power plays, and the moments that made this world even crazier. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Welcome back to Istanbul, where the Bosphorus glitters, the bazaars hum, and the air's thick with secrets as juicy as overripe figs. We're knee-deep in the world of Ottoman prostitutes, where every day was a gamble between getting paid and getting exiled to some dusty corner of the empire. These women weren't just surviving, they were dodging scandals, outsmarting officials, and occasionally stirring up drama that could make a sultan choke on his sherbet. Let's crank up the irony and dive into the wild, absurd, and often heartbreaking stories that define this underworld, where the stakes were high and the rewards were, well, let's just say they were complicated. Picture Zainab, our scrappy heroine, waking up to another day in Galata's red light district. Her room's a sauna, her last client stiffed her, and the local gossip mill's already churning out rumors about her latest indiscretion. But Zainab's not just any hustler. She's got a knack for turning chaos into opportunity, and chaos? Oh, the Ottoman Empire had that in spades. Prostitution wasn't just a job. It was a front row seat to the empire's dirtiest laundry. These women saw it all: corrupt officials, cheating husbands, even the occasional palace insider slumming it for a thrill. And sometimes they didn't just witness the scandals, they caused them. Let's talk about a few of these moments that had Istanbul buzzing louder than a swarm of bees in a baklava shop. First up, let's meet a woman we'll call Nuria, a prostitute with a tongue sharper than a Janissaries sword and a knack for trouble. Nuria worked in one of Constantinople's better brothels. Not quite a palace, but a step up from the alleyway dives. She had a client, let's call him Mehmed, a mid-level bureaucrat with a big ego and an even bigger secret. He was skimming taxes from the Sultan's coffers. Nuria, being the observant type, overheard him bragging about it one night, probably after too much raki. Most women in her position would have kept quiet. Loose lips sink ships, or in this case, get you flogged. But Nuria, she saw an opportunity. She started dropping hints to other clients, letting the rumor spread like wildfire. Before long, Mehmed's dirty dealings were the talk of the town, and he was hauled off to face the Sultan's wrath. Nuria, she got a nice little payout from a rival official who was thrilled to see Mehmed go down. Moral of the story: never underestimate a woman who knows where the bodies are buried, or in this case, where the gold is hidden. This wasn't an isolated incident. Prostitutes were often at the heart of Ottoman scandals, not because they were inherently scandalous, but because they were the empire's unofficial intelligence network. Think about it. They had access to men at their most vulnerable, drunk, boastful, or just plain careless. A merchant might let slip about a shady deal. A soldier might rant about a mutiny in the ranks. These women were like human USB drives, collecting data and when it suited them, passing it along. Some worked with spies or informants, feeding tidbits to the highest bidder. Others used their knowledge to blackmail clients who thought they could get away with not paying. It was a dangerous game. Get caught, and you're not just a prostitute, you're a traitor. But for those who played it well, like Nuri, it was a ticket to power, or at least a few extra coins to stash under the floorboards. Now, let's talk about the palace, because no Ottoman story is complete without a peek behind the harem walls. The Topkapi Palace was the Sultan's playground, a maze of opulence where concubines, eunuchs, and scheming viziers played a never-ending game of chess. Prostitutes outside the palace didn't have the silk cushions or the armed guards, but they weren't entirely disconnected from this world. Some high-end courtesans, think Fatma from Part 1, catered to the elite, including palace officials who couldn't be seen dallying with the Sultan's women. These encounters were a goldmine for gossip, and sometimes they sparked scandals that rippled all the way to the throne. Take the tale of a mysterious woman we'll call Elif, a courtesan so charming she reportedly had a vizier wrapped around her finger. When he started funneling her state funds to keep her happy, his rivals pounced. The scandal ended with him losing his head, literally, and Elif vanishing into the night, probably with enough gold to start a new life in Damascus. The lesson? In the Ottoman Empire, love was a battlefield, and prostitutes were often the ones holding the map. But not every scandal was so glamorous. For every Nuriye or Elif, there were dozens of women like Zainab, caught in the crossfire of society's hypocrisy. Take the case of the Great Brothel Bust of 1574, when a particularly pious governor decided Istanbul needed a moral makeover. He sent his men to raid Galata's brothels, rounding up women and dragging them before a judge who probably visited those same brothels on weekends. The women were fined, some were whipped, and a few were exiled to remote islands where the only company was seagulls and regret. The absurdity? The raids barely dented the trade. Within weeks, the brothels were back in business, and the governor was quietly accepting bribes to look the other way. Zainab probably stood in the courtroom, rolling her eyes as the judge preached about virtue, knowing full well he'd be back in Galata by Friday. It's the kind of dark comedy that defined this world. Everyone was complicit, but only the women paid the price. Let's not forget the cultural quirks that made this life even weirder. The Ottomans were obsessed with appearances, so prostitutes had to master the art of disguise. They couldn't exactly advertise their services in the town square, so they got creative. Some posed as seamstresses or midwives, professions that gave them an excuse to move freely and meet clients. Others used the cover of religious festivals, blending into the crowds of pilgrims and slipping away for private prayers. It was a masterclass in subterfuge, like being a spy in your own city. And the clients? They played along, because nothing says I'm a respectable citizen like sneaking into a brothel disguised as a fruit vendor. The whole system was a farce, held together by winks, nods, and a mutual agreement to pretend everything was fine. Disease and danger were still ever present, though. Syphilis was the grim reaper of the trade, and medical care was a mix of superstition and wishful thinking. Some women turned to amulets or prayers, hoping divine intervention would keep them healthy. Others relied on quack doctors who'd sell you a potion that was half rosewater, half desperation. And then there was the violence. Clients could be brutal. Some saw prostitutes as property, not people. A bad night could mean a beating or worse. Zainab probably had a knife hidden somewhere, just in case. Yet, despite the risks, these women kept going. Because the alternative, starvation, homelessness, or a forced marriage to a man who'd treat you worse, wasn't any better. But here's where it gets inspiring, in a twisted sort of way. These women weren't just victims of circumstance, they were architects of their own survival. Some, like our friend Aisha from Part 2, turned the tables using their earnings to buy freedom or influence. Others formed tight-knit communities, sharing resources and protecting each other from the worst of the world. These weren't just business transactions, they were acts of defiance against a system that tried to crush them. Imagine Zainab and her friends huddled in a back room, laughing over a client's terrible poetry or plotting how to dodge the next raid. It's the kind of camaraderie born from shared struggle, a reminder that even in the darkest times, people find ways to carve out moments of joy. So, what does this all tell us? The world of Ottoman prostitutes was a pressure cooker of scandal, survival, and sheer nerve. These women were at the heart of the empire's contradictions, profiting from its vices while bearing the brunt of its judgment. They were spies, hustlers, and sometimes even poets, navigating a society that needed them but refused to admit it? Drop a comment below. What's the most absurd thing you've ever done to get by, and how does it stack up to these Ottoman legends? And if you're loving this wild, ironic dive into history's shadows, stick around for part 4, where we'll wrap up with the legacy of these women and the final jaw-dropping twists of their story. Trust me, you're not ready for what's coming. We're back in the Ottoman Empire one last time, where the minarets cast long shadows over Istanbul's cobblestone streets, and the air hums with the clink of coins, the murmur of secrets, and the occasional curse of a merchant who just lost his donkey. This is the world of prostitutes like Zainab, Fatma, Nuria, and Aisha, women who played a ruthless game of survival in a society that loved to judge but never missed a chance to profit. We've seen their hustle, their scandals, and the absurdities that made their lives a mix of dark comedy and raw resilience. Now, let's pull back the final curtain and explore what it all meant. The legacy of these women, the contradictions they exposed, and the stories that lingered like smoke over the Bosphorus. Buckle up, because this finale is as wild as a camel race in a sandstorm. Let's start with Zainab, our scrappy survivor who's been with us since the beginning. By now, she's probably in her late 20s, ancient by the standards of her trade. Her room in Galata's still a mess, her landlord still a creep, and the local imam still preaching fire and brimstone while sneaking glances at her window. But Zainab's no longer the wide-eyed girl from Anatolia. She's a veteran now with a mental map of every alley, a knack for spotting trouble, and a stash of coins hidden so well even the Sultan's spies couldn't find it. She's seen it all. Clients who promised the moon and paid in dirt, raids that turned her life upside down, and moments of camaraderie with her sisters in arms that kept her sane. Zainab's story isn't just hers. It's the story of thousands of women who carved out a life in the cracks of an empire that both needed them and despised them. What's the legacy of these women? For starters, they were the ultimate mirror to the Ottoman Empire's hypocrisy. This was a society obsessed with honor, piety, and order, yet it ran on a shadow economy where prostitutes were as essential as bakers or blacksmiths. The state taxed brothels, officials took bribes, and even the most devout men weren't above a late-night visit to Galata. These women exposed the gap between what the empire preached and what it practiced. They were the open secret everyone pretended not to see, like a stain on a silk robe that everyone agrees to ignore. But they weren't just passive pawns, they were players, using their wits to navigate a system that was rigged from the start. Some, like Fatma, built mini empires of their own. Others, like Nuria, turned gossip into power. And even those who didn't make it big, like Zainab, showed a kind of stubborn resilience that deserves a nod, if not a statue. Let's talk about the bigger picture. The Ottoman Empire was a global powerhouse, bridging Europe, Asia, and Africa. Its cities were melting pots where cultures clashed and blended, and prostitutes were right in the middle of it. They served clients from every corner of the empire: Turks, Greeks, Arabs, Venetians, even the occasional Russian who got lost on his way to the Black Sea. These women weren't just part of the economy, they were part of the cultural exchange. They heard stories from distant lands, picked up phrases in a dozen languages, and sometimes even influenced the trends that swept through Istanbul's markets. Imagine Zainab learning a Venetian dance from a sailor client, then teaching it to her friends who turn it into the talk of the town. It's a small thing, but it's a reminder that these women weren't just surviving. They were shaping the world around them, even if history forgot to write it down. But let's not sugarcoat it. The cost of this life was brutal. Disease was a constant specter, and most women didn't live long enough to retire. Syphilis could end your career faster than a sultan's decree, and the cures were often worse than the disease. Think mercury potions that left you shaking like a leaf. Violence was another reality. Clients could turn nasty, pimps could get greedy, and the law wasn't exactly your friend. A bad night could mean a black eye or a one-way ticket to exile. And then there was the social stigma. Ottoman society loved to point fingers, and prostitutes were the easiest target. Neighbors whispered, families disowned, and even the kids throwing stones in the street knew who to aim for. Yet, these women kept going, because the alternative, poverty, starvation, or a marriage that was just another kind of cage, wasn't any better. The absurdity of it all is almost poetic. Take the way the empire regulated the trade. Prostitution was never fully legal, but it was tolerated as long as it stayed in its lane. Brothels had to be in specific neighborhoods, like Galata or Üsküdar, and the women had to follow a labyrinth of unwritten rules. Step too far out of line, say by soliciting in the wrong market, and you'd face the wrath of a judge who was probably a client last week. The state's solution to this moral mess? Periodic crackdowns that were more theater than justice. Picture a governor storming into a brothel, shouting about sin while his men pocket bribes and the women scatter like cats in a rainstorm. By the next month, everything's back to normal, because nobody, not even the Sultan, could afford to shut down the trade entirely. It's like trying to ban coffee in a city that runs on caffeine. Good luck with that. And then there's the harem connection, because no Ottoman story is complete without it. The Sultan's harem was its own world, a gilded cage where concubines lived in luxury, but had about as much freedom as a caged nightingale. Prostitutes outside the palace were the flip side of that coin, free to move but chained by poverty and scorn. Yet the two worlds weren't as separate as you'd think. Some high-end courtesans moved in circles that brushed up against the palace elite, serving viziers or ambassadors who wanted something less official than a harem girl. These women were the bridge between the streets and the palace, carrying gossip, secrets, and sometimes even influence. A courtesan like Aisha, who we met earlier, might have had a better read on palace politics than half the Sultan's advisors, just from listening to her client's pillow talk. It's a reminder that power in the Ottoman Empire wasn't just in the throne room, it was in the shadows too. What's heartbreaking is how little of this story made it into the history books. The Ottoman archives are packed with records of wars, taxes, and the Sultan's latest hunting trip, but the women who kept the empire's underbelly humming? They're barely a footnote. Their lives were erased, their names forgotten, their stories buried under layers of shame and silence. Yet, they were everywhere. In the taverns of Galata, the bathhouses of Cairo, the boats on the Nile. They were the backbone of a shadow economy, the confidants of the powerful, and the survivors who laughed in the face of a world that tried to break them. Zainab might have never gotten a statue, but every coin she hid, every client she outsmarted, was a tiny act of defiance against a system that saw her as disposable. So, what's the final takeaway? The dark truth of prostitutes in the Ottoman Empire is a story of contradiction, resilience, and the kind of irony that makes you want to laugh and cry at the same time. These women were the empire's dirty secret, its scapegoats, and its unsung heroes. They navigated a world of double standards with a wit sharper than a scimitar, turning survival into an art form. They faced disease, violence, and scorn, yet they kept going, because giving up wasn't an option. Their legacy isn't in the history books, it's in the cracks of the empire's facade, in the stories whispered in the bazaars, in the defiance of women who refused to be erased. Drop a comment below. What's the one thing from this wild ride that stuck with you the most? Was it Zainab's hustle, Fatma's empire, or the sheer absurdity of an empire taxing sin while preaching virtue? And if you've loved this dive into the Ottoman underbelly, let me know what other forgotten corners of history you want to explore. Maybe the pirates of the Barbary coast, the spies of the Byzantine court? The possibilities are endless, and I'm dying to hear your thoughts. Thanks for sticking with me through this 4-part saga. Now go out there and tell someone about the badass women who kept the Ottoman Empire's secrets. Until next time, keep your wit sharp and your baklava sweeter. Picture the Ottoman Empire in its prime, a colossal beast stretching from the Danube to the Nile, where Istanbul's minarets gleam under the sun and the streets buzz with traders, poets, and the occasional stray goat. It's the 14th century, and this empire's got ambition. Big, messy, world-conquering ambition. At the heart of its power are the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite fighting force, feared from Vienna to Baghdad. These guys weren't just soldiers, they were the empire's Swiss army knife. Loyal, lethal, and ready to die for a cause they didn't always understand. But here's the kicker. Most of them started life as Christian kids, stolen from their families, brainwashed into loyalty, and turned into the Sultan's personal killing machines. If that sounds like a dystopian nightmare, buckle up, because this is just the beginning of the Janissaries' dark, absurd tale. Let's set the stage. The Ottoman Empire was a juggernaut, a melting pot of cultures held together by sheer force, cunning diplomacy, and a knack for turning chaos into order. The sultans ruled from the Topkapi Palace, surrounded by scheming viziers, pampered concubines, and enough gold to make a dragon jealous. But to keep this empire running, they needed an army that could crush rebellions, conquer cities, and scare the pants off anyone who looked at them funny. Enter the Janissaries, a corps so elite they made other soldiers look like they were playing dress-up. These guys were the Navy SEALs of their day, armed with curved swords, muskets, and a loyalty so fierce it was practically a personality trait. But the road to becoming a Janissary, it was less hero's journey and more survival horror. It all starts with the Dev Sherma, the Ottoman Empire's twisted version of a talent scout program. Picture a sleepy village in the Balkans, say Serbia or Albania, where life's simple. You farm, you pray, you try not to die of plague. Then, one day, Ottoman officials roll into town like tax collectors from hell. They're not here for your crops or your coins, they're here for your kids. The Dev Shermi, or blood tax, was the empire's way of plucking young Christian boys, usually aged 8 to 15, from their families to serve the Sultan. These weren't random grabs. The officials had a checklist. Strong? Check. Healthy? Check. Smart enough to learn, but not so smart they'd start asking questions? Double check. If you fit the bill, you were torn from your parents, marched to Istanbul, and thrust into a system designed to strip you of everything you were. Let's follow a boy we'll call Marco, a 10-year-old from a Serbian village with dreams of being a shepherd like his dad. One minute, he's chasing goats. The next, he's on a caravan to the big city, crying for his mom, while some grizzled Ottoman officer tells him to toughen up. Marco's not alone. Thousands of boys like him were taken every few years, a human harvest to feed the empire's war machine. The logic was brutal but effective. Christian boys, far from home, had no loyalty to their old lives. They could be molded into perfect soldiers, fanatically devoted to the Sultan. It's like kidnapping someone to make them your best friend, except with more swords and fewer birthday parties. Once in Istanbul, Marco's life becomes a crash course in transformation. Step 1. Conversion to Islam. The Ottomans weren't subtle about this. The boys were circumcised, given new names, Marco's now Mehmet, and taught the basics of the faith. Resistance wasn't an option. You either adapted or disappeared into the empire's vast, shadowy bureaucracy. Step 2. Training. These kids were sent to special schools, often in the palace or military barracks, where they learned everything from Turkish to sword fighting to the fine art of not dying in a siege. The training was brutal. Think boot camp with a side of calligraphy. You'd run drills until your legs gave out, study until your brain hurt, and pray 5 times a day to prove your loyalty. The goal? To turn you into a Janissary, a soldier so disciplined he'd charge into a cannon's mouth if the Sultan said so. But here's where the irony kicks in. The Janissaries weren't just grunts, they were elite. They got paid, decently too, which was more than most peasants could say. They lived in barracks that were practically palaces compared to the villages they came from. They had status, swagger, and a uniform that screamed, "I'm kind of a big deal." For a kid like Mehmet, who started life herding goats, this was a bizarre glow-up. Sure, you were ripped from your family and brainwashed, but now you're dining on pilaf and marching to the beat of the empire's war drums. It's the ultimate rags to riches story, except the riches come with a body count, and the rags were your old identity, burned to ash. Of course, it wasn't all glory. The Janissaries were forbidden from marrying or owning property, at least in the early days. The Sultan wanted their loyalty undivided, like a jealous girlfriend who checks your phone every 5 minutes. They were also expected to die for the cause, no questions asked. Imagine being Mehmet, now 18, standing on a battlefield in Hungary, staring down a wall of pikes and cannons. Your training says charge, your instincts say run, but running means execution for desertion. So you charge, because that's what Janissaries do. They fought in every major Ottoman campaign, from the conquest of Constantinople in 1453 to the sieges of Vienna. They were the tip of the spear, the first through the breach, and often the last to leave the battlefield, usually in a coffin. The absurdity of it all is staggering. The Ottoman Empire built its might on the backs of stolen children, turned them into its fiercest defenders, and then acted shocked when things got messy. Because, spoiler alert, they did. The Janissaries weren't just loyal drones, they were human, with ambitions, grudges, and a growing sense that maybe the Sultan wasn't always worth dying for. By the 16th century, they were starting to flex their muscle, not just on the battlefield, but in the palace. They'd demand better pay, better food, or just the right to grow a beard without someone calling it treason. This was the beginning of their transformation from obedient pawns to political players, and it's where things get really juicy. Let's zoom out for a second. The Janissaries weren't just a military force, they were a social experiment, a twisted blend of meritocracy and slavery. They were outsiders, Christian boys in a Muslim empire, yet they rose to become its backbone. They were feared and respected, hated and admired. They were the empire's greatest asset and eventually its biggest headache. For every Mehmet who charged into battle with a song in his heart, there was another who started wondering why he was risking his life for a sultan who didn't know his name. This tension between loyalty and rebellion, duty and desire, runs through their story like a fault line, ready to crack. So, what's the takeaway from part 1? The Janissaries were the Ottoman Empire's ultimate paradox, a brotherhood of stolen boys turned into elite warriors, bound by a loyalty that was both their strength and their shackle. They were proof that you can build an empire on audacity, but you can't control the human spirit forever. Drop a comment below. What's the wildest thing you've ever been forced to do for someone else's grand plan? And if you're hooked on this tale of blood, sweat, and Ottoman swagger, stick around for part 2, where we'll dive into the battles, the betrayals, and the moments when the Janissaries started to realize they held more power than the Sultan ever wanted them to know. Trust me, it's about to get wilder. We're back in the Ottoman Empire, where Istanbul's streets pulse with the clatter of swords, the stench of gunpowder, and the faint hope that you'll live long enough to spend your paycheck. The Janissaries, those elite warriors forged from kidnapped Christian boys, are the Sultan's pride and joy. Think of them as his personal attack dogs, trained to bite on command. But life as a Janissary wasn't just about looking badass in a fancy hat and charging into battle. It was a high-stakes game of survival, where you had to navigate bloody wars, palace politics, and a society that saw you as both hero and outsider. Let's follow our boy Mehmet, now a seasoned Janissary, as he wades through the chaos, sword in hand, sarcasm in heart, and a growing suspicion that this whole loyalty thing might be a scam. Picture Mehmet, 20 years old, standing in the barracks with his comrades, polishing his scimitar and trying not to think about the last guy who got executed for dropping his musket. The Janissaries were the empire's heavy hitters, and their job was simple: win wars, crush rebels, and make sure everyone from Vienna to Baghdad knew the Ottomans meant business. They fought in every major campaign, from the conquests of Sultan Mehmed II, who turned Constantinople into Istanbul in 1453, to the epic sieges of Rhodes and Malta. These weren't clean, Hollywood-style battles. They were brutal, muddy slogs where you'd be dodging arrows, hacking through enemy lines, and praying your boots didn't get stuck in the blood-soaked dirt. Mehmet's probably got scars on his scars, each one a story of a day he didn't die. Let's talk about a typical day on the job. Imagine the siege of Belgrade in 1521. The city's a fortress, bristling with cannons and soldiers who really don't want to be Ottoman subjects. Mehmet and his Janissary brothers are at the front, because that's where the Sultan puts his best or most expendable troops. They're hauling siege equipment, digging trenches, and charging walls under a hail of arrows that makes a rainstorm look friendly. The Janissaries were known for their discipline, moving like a well-oiled machine while everyone else was screaming and running in circles. They'd form ranks, fire their muskets in perfect sync, and then draw their swords for the messy part. If you survived, you got loot, gold, weapons, maybe a nice rug. If you didn't, well, at least you went out looking heroic. But here's the absurdity. These guys were fighting for an empire that didn't fully trust them. The Janissaries were outsiders, former Christians raised to serve a Muslim sultan. They were elite, sure, but they were also kept on a tight leash. No marriage, no property, no life outside the core, at least in the early days. The Sultan wanted them loyal to him alone, like a cult leader with a better mustache. Mehmet's probably sitting around a campfire after a battle, sharing flatbread with his mates and joking about how they're the most feared men in the empire, but can't even grow a beard without permission. It's the kind of dark humor you develop when your life expectancy is shorter than a camel's temper. And the battles? They were relentless. Take the Battle of Mohatz in 1526, a slaughter so one-sided it was like the Ottomans brought a tank to a knife fight. The Janissaries led the charge, cutting through Hungarian cavalry like a hot knife through butter. By the end, the field was a graveyard, and the Janissaries were picking through the spoils, probably wondering if they'd ever see a day off. But it wasn't just foreign wars. They also crushed internal rebellions, like the Jalali revolts, where angry peasants decided they'd had enough of taxes and tyranny. Mehmet's out there, putting down his own people. Well, not his people anymore, but you get the idea. It's a weird kind of loyalty, fighting for a system that stole you from your home and expects you to be grateful. Now, let's talk about the perks, because being a Janissary wasn't all blood and misery. They got paid, better than most soldiers, and way better than the peasants starving back in the villages. They had barracks that were practically luxurious, with hot meals and actual beds, not just a pile of straw. They also had swagger. The Janissaries' uniforms, flowing robes, tall hats, and those iconic mustaches made them the rock stars of the Ottoman military. When they marched through Istanbul, people stopped to stare, partly out of awe, partly out of fear. Mehmet's probably got a strut that says, "Yeah, I'm kind of a big deal," even if he's still haunted by the memory of his mom's face when he was taken. But the perks came with a price. The Janissaries were under constant scrutiny. One wrong move, say mouthing off to an officer or sneaking a sip of forbidden wine, and you could be demoted, whipped, or worse. The Sultan's spies were everywhere, and the Janissaries' loyalty was tested constantly. Imagine Mehmet at a checkpoint, some bureaucrat eyeing him like he's about to start a revolution over a bad kebab. And then there was the palace, where the real drama brewed. The Topkapi Palace was a snake pit of politics, with viziers plotting, concubines scheming, and the Sultan occasionally forgetting he had an empire to run. The Janissaries were supposed to stay out of it, but they weren't robots. They had ears, they had grudges, and they were starting to realize they weren't just muscle, they were power. Here's where things get juicy. By the 16th century, the Janissaries were more than just soldiers. They were a brotherhood, a tribe, a gang with better weapons. They started pushing back. They'd demand higher pay, better food, or the right to skip the occasional drill. The sultans, who relied on them to keep the empire together, had to play nice. Sort of. Imagine Mehmet and his buddies staging a mini protest, banging their spoons on their plates because the rice was cold. It sounds funny, but it was a big deal. These guys had the power to make or break a sultan, and they knew it. In 1525, they rioted in Istanbul, looting shops and scaring the daylights out of the bureaucrats. The sultan had to cave, tossing them extra coins and promises of better rations. It was the first sign that the Janissaries weren't just pawns, they were players. The irony is delicious. The Ottoman Empire created the Janissaries to be loyal drones, but by giving them weapons, training, and status, they accidentally created a monster. These guys were supposed to be the Sultan's shield, but they were starting to act like his sword, pointed at his own throat. Mehmet's probably whispering with his mates in the barracks, joking about how they could run the empire better than the guy in the palace. It's half joke, half truth, and it's planting seeds that'll grow into full-blown rebellion down the line. But for now, they're still the empire's backbone, charging into battles, quelling riots, and keeping the Sultan's enemies at bay. Let's not forget the human cost. Mehmet's life is a parade of near-death experiences. Every battle's a roll of the dice. Will it be an arrow to the chest or a cannonball to the face? Disease was another killer. Camp fever could wipe out half a regiment before the enemy even showed up. And then there's the psychological toll. Mehmet was torn from his family, stripped of his identity, and told to kill for a cause he didn't choose. He's got brothers in arms, sure, but he's also got nightmares of a village he barely remembers. The Janissaries were trained to be fearless, but they were still human, and humans break under pressure. So, what's the takeaway? The Janissaries were the Ottoman Empire's greatest weapon, but they were also its most dangerous liability. They fought, bled, and died for an empire that saw them as tools, not people. Yet they were starting to see themselves as something more, a force to be reckoned with, a brotherhood that could shake the palace walls. Drop a comment below. What's the most absurd thing you've ever done for a paycheck, and how does it stack up to Mehmet's life? And if you're loving this bloody, sarcastic dive into Ottoman history, stick around for part 3, where we'll explore the scandals, the power grabs, and the moment the Janissaries went from loyal dogs to wolves at the Sultan's door. It's about to get wilder. Picture this. It's the 17th century, and the Ottoman Empire is still strutting like a peacock, but the feathers are starting to fall out. Istanbul is a pressure cooker of ambition, greed, and the kind of backstabbing that makes a soap opera look like a kid's show. At the center of it all are the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite warriors, forged from stolen boys like our friend Mehmet, who's now a battle-hardened veteran with a chip on his shoulder. and a sword sharp enough to cut through the empire's lies. These guys were supposed to be the Sultan's loyal hounds, but they're starting to growl, and the palace is sweating. Welcome to part 3, where we dive into the scandals, power plays, and outright rebellion that turned the Janissaries from obedient soldiers into the Sultan's worst nightmare. Buckle up, it's about to get messy. Let's catch up with Mehmet, now in his 30s, a grizzled Janissary with a mustache that could intimidate a lion, and a list of grudges longer than the Bosphorus. He's fought in a dozen battles, from the muddy fields of Hungary to the dusty plains of Persia, and he's got the scars to prove it. His life's a cycle of march, fight, bleed, repeat, with the occasional break to haggle over a kebab in Istanbul's bazaar. But something's changed. Mehmet's not the wide-eyed kid who swore loyalty to the Sultan without question. He's seen too much: corrupt officers skimming his pay, viziers plotting in the palace, and sultans who treat the Janissaries like disposable toys. The brotherhood he's part of, once a source of pride, is starting to feel like a trap. And he's not alone. The Janissaries are no longer just a fighting force, they're a political beast. By the 1600s, they've got numbers, tens of thousands strong, an influence that makes even the Sultan nervous. They're not just soldiers anymore. They're a lobby, a gang, a ticking time bomb. The Empire's still relying on them to crush enemies, but the Janissaries are starting to ask, what's in it for us? They want more pay, better food, and maybe a little respect instead of being treated like glorified cannon fodder. Mehmet's probably sitting in the barracks, sharpening his blade and muttering with his mates about how the Sultan's latest tax hike is funding another gold-plated fountain while they're dodging arrows for scraps. It's the kind of resentment that festers, and in the Ottoman Empire, festering resentment is a spark in a powder keg. Let's talk about one of the juiciest scandals that lit that spark: the reign of Sultan Ibrahim the Mad in the 1640s. This guy was less ruler and more human disaster, obsessed with furs, orgies, and throwing coins into the sea for fun. The Janissaries, who were out there risking their lives to keep his empire together, weren't exactly thrilled. When Ibrahim started ignoring their demands for better pay and promoting his favorite cronies over battle-hardened veterans, the barracks started buzzing with dissent. Mehmet and his crew probably had a betting pool on how long it'd take for Ibrahim to screw things up so badly they'd have to step in. Spoiler, they didn't have to wait long. In 1648, the Janissaries teamed up with the palace elite and staged a coup, deposing Ibrahim and installing his 7-year-old son, Mehmed IV, on the throne. Ibrahim ended up strangled in a dungeon, and the Janissaries? They walked away whistling, knowing they'd just flexed their power in a way that made the palace shake. This wasn't a one-off. The Janissaries were starting to realize they weren't just the Sultan's muscle. They were kingmakers. They could make or break a ruler, and they knew it. Picture Mehmet in a smoky tavern, clinking cups with his comrades and joking about how they could probably run the empire better than the kid on the throne. It's half laugh, half truth, and it's the kind of talk that gets you executed if the wrong ears hear it. But the Janissaries were getting bold. They'd riot over late pay, refuse orders they didn't like, and even dabble in the palace's endless game of intrigue. They were like a union with swords, and the sultans were starting to look less like bosses and more like guys who owed them money. The absurdity of it all is almost beautiful. The Ottoman Empire created the Janissaries to be loyal, obedient, and expendable, but by giving them training, status, and a front-row seat to the empire's corruption, they accidentally made them dangerous. These guys were supposed to be the Sultan's shield, but now they're holding the sword, and it's pointed at his neck. Take the 1622 rebellion, when the Janissaries got fed up with Sultan Osman II. This guy was young, ambitious, and dumb enough to think he could reform the Janissaries without asking their permission. He wanted to replace them with a new army, one that wouldn't talk back. Bad move. Mehmet and his buddies caught wind of it, marched on the palace, and demanded Osman's head. Literally, they got it. Osman was strangled, and the Janissaries proved they weren't just soldiers. They were a force that could topple thrones. It's like if your security guards decided they didn't like your management style and staged a hostile takeover. But let's not romanticize this. Life as a Janissary was still a grind. Mehmet's days are a blur of drills, battles, and the constant threat of betrayal. The barracks were a brotherhood, sure, but they were also a snake pit. Ambitious officers schemed for promotions, spies reported to the palace, and one wrong word could land you in a dungeon. The Janissaries were also starting to bend the rules they'd once lived by. That no marriage, no property thing. By the 17th century, they were ignoring it. Mehmet's probably got a wife tucked away in a back street, maybe even a kid or two, and he's dabbling in trade on the side, selling rugs or spices to make extra cash. The Janissaries were becoming less like monks and more like a mafia, with their hands in everything from protection rackets to the grain market, and the battles never stopped. The Ottoman Empire was always at war, against the Habsburgs, the Safavids, or some rebel governor who thought he could play sultan. Mehmet's been to places he can't pronounce, fighting enemies he doesn't care about, all for a paycheck that barely covers the cost of his boots. Take the siege of Vienna in 1683, a disaster that showed the Janissaries at their best and worst. They charged the walls with their usual grit, but the campaign was a mess. Bad planning, worse leadership, and a Polish king who showed up like a superhero to save the day. The Janissaries took heavy losses, and Mehmet probably limped back to Istanbul wondering why he's still doing this. The empire's glory days were fading, and the Janissaries were starting to feel like they were propping up a sinking ship. The human cost was brutal. Mehmet's got friends who didn't make it. Some cut down in battle, others lost to disease or executed for stepping out of line. The Janissaries were trained to be fearless, but fear was part of the deal. Fear of failure, fear of betrayal, fear of waking up to find the sultans decided you're more trouble than you're worth. And then there's the psychological toll. Mehmet was stolen from his family, stripped of his identity, and turned into a cog in the empire's war machine. He's got memories of a village he'll never see again, a language he barely remembers, and a nagging sense that he's fighting for a cause that doesn't care about him. It's the kind of existential crisis that hits harder than a cannonball. Yet, there's something inspiring in the chaos. The Janissaries weren't just victims, they were survivors who turned the empire's own system against it. They took the power they were given, swords, training, status, and used it to carve out a space for themselves. Mehmet's not just a soldier, he's a hustler, a schemer, a guy who's learned to play the game better than the palace ever expected. The Janissaries' brotherhood was their strength, a bond forged in blood and barracks, where a shared joke or a smuggled jug of wine could make even the worst day bearable. They were the empire's creation, but they were starting to write their own story. So, what's the takeaway? The Janissaries were a walking contradiction, loyal soldiers who became rebels, outsiders who became kingmakers, pawns who learned to play chess. They exposed the Ottoman Empire's cracks, showing that even the mightiest system can't control the human spirit forever. Drop a comment below. What's the most epic power move you've seen someone pull, and how does it stack up to the Janissaries' palace coups? And if you're hooked on this wild, bloody ride through Ottoman history, stick around for part 4, where we'll wrap up with the Janissaries' final act, a downfall so dramatic it'll make your head spin. Trust me, you're not ready for the end. Welcome back to the Ottoman Empire, where Istanbul's streets hum with the clatter of swords, the stench of gunpowder, and the whispers of a revolution brewing in the barracks. The Janissaries, once the Sultan's loyal attack dogs, have become a force of their own. Part brotherhood, part mafia, all trouble. Our boy Mehmet, now a grizzled veteran pushing 40, has seen it all. Wars that broke his body, scandals that broke his faith, and a palace that treats him like a tool one day and a threat the next. This is part 4, the grand finale, where the Janissaries' story spirals into a mix of defiance, disaster, and dark irony that'll leave you wondering how an empire could fumble its greatest asset so spectacularly. Let's dive into the endgame. By the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire is starting to creak like an old ship in a storm. The glory days of conquering Constantinople are long gone, and the sultans are more focused on palace parties than keeping their enemies at bay. The Janissaries, meanwhile, are no longer the disciplined killing machines they once were. Mehmet's generation has seen the empire's cracks, corrupt viziers, broke treasuries, and defeats like the disastrous 1683 siege of Vienna, where the Janissaries took a beating and came home limping. They're not just soldiers anymore. They're a political powerhouse, meddling in everything from trade to throne-making. Mehmet's probably got a side hustle selling spices, a wife he's not supposed to have, and a chip on his shoulder the size of the Topkapi Palace. The Janissaries' power is their curse. They've toppled sultans like Osman II in 1622 and Ibrahim the Mad in 1648, proving they can make or break rulers. But this makes them dangerous, not just to the empire's enemies, but to the sultan himself. Picture Mehmet in the barracks, joking with his mates about how they could probably run the show better than the guy in the turban. It's not just talk anymore. They're demanding higher pay, refusing orders, and even picking fights with rival factions like the Sipahis, the Empire's cavalry. The Janissaries have gone from loyal dogs to wolves, and the palace is starting to notice. Enter Sultan Mahmud II in the early 19th century, a guy with a plan and a serious grudge against the Janissaries. Mahmud's fed up with their antics, riots, extortion, and the fact that they're better at starting rebellions than fighting wars. The empire's losing ground to European powers, and the Janissaries are more interested in protecting their own interests than defending the borders. Mahmud decides it's time for a clean slate. He's got a new army in the works, trained in European style, and he wants the Janissaries gone. But here's the catch. You don't just fire a brotherhood of armed, battle-hardened men who've been running the show for centuries. Mehmet's probably heard rumors of Mahmud's plan, whispering with his comrades over a smuggled jug of raki, wondering if the Sultan's about to pull the rug out from under them. The tension explodes in 1826, in what history calls the auspicious incident, though auspicious is a polite way of saying bloodbath. Mahmud picks a fight, announcing reforms that would effectively sideline the Janissaries. Predictably, they revolt. Mehmet and his brothers march on Istanbul, banging their drums and waving their swords, ready to remind the Sultan who really calls the shots. But Mahmud's ready. He's got his new army, loyal artillery, and a city fed up with the Janissaries' bullying. What happens next is less a battle and more a massacre. The Sultan's forces turn cannons on the Janissary barracks, blasting them to rubble. Those who survive the bombardment are hunted down in the streets. Mehmet, if he's lucky, might have slipped away in the chaos, but thousands of his brothers aren't so fortunate. By the end, the Janissaries are wiped out, executed, exiled, or scattered. The core that held the empire together for 400 years is gone in a matter of days. The irony is thicker than Istanbul's fog. The Janissaries were created to be the Sultan's ultimate weapon, forged from stolen boys like Mehmet, trained to kill and die without question. But by giving them power, status, and a brotherhood stronger than any palace decree, the empire sowed the seeds of its own chaos. They weren't just soldiers, they were survivors who turned the system's rules against it. Mehmet learned to fight, hustle, and scheme, building a life in a world that tried to strip him of everything. But in the end, that same system crushed him, because empires don't like it when their tools start thinking for themselves. What's the legacy of the Janissaries? They were the Ottoman Empire's greatest triumph and its fatal flaw. They conquered cities, toppled kings, and kept the empire running when everything else was falling apart. But they also exposed its rot, corruption, hypocrisy, and a knack for eating its own. Their story is a twisted mirror of the empire itself, a mix of ambition, brutality, and the kind of resilience that comes from having nothing left to lose. Mehmet's life, stolen from a village, shaped by war, ended in betrayal, is a microcosm of that. He was a pawn, a hero, a rebel, and ultimately a ghost, erased by the empire he helped build. The human cost is what hits hardest. Mehmet was taken from his family, stripped of his name, and turned into a cog in a war machine. He fought for a sultan who didn't know him, bled for an empire that didn't care, and died for a cause that betrayed him. The Janissaries' brotherhood was their lifeline. Shared meals, shared scars, shared jokes about the palace's latest screw-up. But even that couldn't save them from the cannons of 1826. Their story is a reminder that power comes with a price, and loyalty is a double-edged sword. The Janissaries were the empire's strength, but also its warning. Give people weapons and a reason to resent you, and don't be surprised when they turn on you. Let's zoom out. The Janissaries weren't just a military force. They were a social experiment gone wrong. They were outsiders, Christian boys in a Muslim empire, turned into its fiercest defenders, only to be discarded when they got too big for their boots. Their rise and fall mirror the Ottoman Empire's own arc, a blaze of glory followed by a slow, messy collapse. They left behind stories of courage, betrayal, and the kind of dark humor you develop when you're staring down a cannon. Mehmet's probably out there somewhere, a faded memory in a tavern song, his name lost but his defiance echoing through the ages. So, what's the final word? The Janissaries were the Ottoman Empire's heartbeat and its breaking point. They were stolen children who became warriors, pawns who became kingmakers, and heroes who became history's footnote. Their story is a wild, tragic ride through a world where survival meant playing a game you couldn't win. They fought, they schemed, they laughed in the face of death, and they paid the ultimate price for it. Drop a comment below. What's the one thing from this saga that stuck with you? Mehmet's stolen childhood, the Janissaries' power plays, or their brutal end? And if you've loved this dive into the Ottoman abyss, tell me what other forgotten history you want to explore. Maybe the pirates of the Mediterranean or the schemers of the Byzantine court. Thanks for sticking with me through this 4-part epic. Now, go tell someone about the boys who became an empire's sword and shield, only to be broken by the hands that forged them. Until next time, keep your blade sharp and your loyalty sharper. Imagine this, a world where holy wars rage across deserts and seas, knights in shining armor charge into battle, and the history books glorify the brave men who fought for God and glory. But what if I told you the real story isn't about the heroes on horseback? It's about the women, forgotten, fierce, and fighting tooth and nail just to survive the madness. Buckle up, because we're diving into the dark, twisted truth of women in the Crusades, a tale of betrayal, brutality, and bizarre absurdities that make modern life look like a spa day. If this hooks you, smash that like button and drop a comment. What's the craziest historical fact you've heard about women in war? Let's uncover the nightmare together. The Crusades, those epic clashes between East and West, spanning from 1095 to 1291, a series of religious romps that promised salvation but delivered mostly slaughter, starvation, and sarcasm-worthy stupidity. Pope Urban II kicks it off at the Council of Clermont, yelling about reclaiming Jerusalem from the infidels, and suddenly Europe's nobility is packing their bags for a holy vacation. But wait, history loves to gloss over the ladies in this lunacy. Women weren't just sitting at home knitting chainmail. They were right in the thick of it, enduring horrors that would make your average reality TV show look tame. Let's start at the beginning, shall we? Picture the First Crusade, 1096. Europe's a mess, famine, feudal fights, and folks desperate for divine intervention. When the call to arms goes out, it's not just men signing up. Women from all walks, noble women, peasants, prostitutes, even nuns, tag along. Why? Some for piety, others for protection, and a few because, hey, staying home meant dealing with the local lord's taxes in ways that weren't exactly voluntary. Enter Eleanor of Aquitaine, though she shines later. For now, think of the anonymous masses. These women marched with the People's Crusade, led by that charismatic fool Peter the Hermit. Thousands strong, but poorly armed, they trudged across Europe, begging, borrowing, and sometimes stealing to eat. The absurdity hits hard. Armies of zealots, including women and children, thinking God would provide. Spoiler, he didn't. They hit Constantinople, where the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I is like, who invited these ragtag pilgrims? But the real pain starts in Anatolia. Seljuk Turks ambush them, arrows raining down, swords slashing. Women, they're not spared. Captured ones face rape, slavery, or worse. Survival meant hiding in bushes, drinking from puddles tainted with blood, and watching your kids starve. One chronicler notes women giving birth on the march, only to abandon newborns because carrying them meant death for all. Ironic, isn't it? Crusading for a holy land while turning the journey into a hellscape. But let's zoom in on a hypothetical yet all too real woman. Call her Matilda, a peasant from France. Her husband's fired up by sermons, sells their cow for a sword, and off they go. Matilda packs herbs for healing, a dagger for defense, and dreams of paradise. The road? Endless. Feet blistered, dysentery rampant. Oh, the glamour. They cross the rain and pogroms erupt against Jews, because why not add anti-Semitism to the mix? Women like Matilda witness massacres, sometimes participating out of fear or frenzy. Absurd? Absolutely. Painful? Beyond words. Arriving in the east, the sieges begin. Antioch, 1098. A 8-month nightmare. Crusaders surround the city, but supplies dwindle. Women forage for roots, boil leather belts for soup. Starvation sets in, cannibalism rumors swirl. Albert of Aachen writes of women eating the flesh of the dead to survive. Imagine the irony. Fighting for Christ's body while gnawing on a comrade's, and the Turks, they hurl heads over walls, including women's, to demoralize. Yet some women fight back. Legends tell of female archers on the walls. But wait, No, that's the defenders. Crusader women? They're mending wounds, hauling water under fire, and praying their husbands don't die, leaving them vulnerable. Then, the miracle, or was it? A holy lance is discovered, boosting morale. They take Antioch, but now they're besieged inside by Kerboga's army. More starvation. Women sell their bodies for bread, or so sources claim, with that medieval judgment dripping sarcasm. Survival's price, dignity. Finally breakout, victory, but at what cost? Bodies pile up, including women's. Jerusalem falls in 1099, a bloodbath. Fulcher of Chartres describes streets running with blood to the knees. Women? Massacred alongside men or enslaved. Godfrey of Bouillon becomes ruler, but for the women who survived, a new life in Outremer, the Crusader states, precarious, perilous. Outremer, a patchwork of kingdoms like Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli. Women here navigate an absurd blend of cultures, Frankish, Byzantine, Arab. Noble women wield power, take Melisende of Jerusalem, daughter of Baldwin II. She inherits the throne in 1131, co-rules with her husband Fulk, but he's a jealous jerk, accuses her of affairs. Melisende fights back, literally. Supporters rally, Fulk backs down. Ironic, in a land conquered by men, a woman queens it up. But the pain? Constant threats from Saladin's predecessors. Sieges, raids, women defend castles like at Kirak where Stephanie de Milly holds out. Peasant women? Toiling in fields under scorching sun, fearing kidnappings by Bedouins. Slavery thrives, captured Christian women end up in harems, converted or not. Absurd tales, some rise as concubines influencing sultans, like Shajar al-Dur, though later, she's Egyptian, becomes sultana. But during Crusades, think of the anonymous, forced labor, sexual exploitation. Survival means adapting, learning Arabic, blending in, or escaping back west, branded traitors. In the Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, a flop led by Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. Enter Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen and crusader. She joins Louis, bringing her vassals. Rumors fly, she's too flashy, dresses like an Amazon. At Constantinople, she's dazzled, Louis, jealous. The march south? Disaster. Turks attack at Mount Cadmus. Eleanor's blamed for baggage trains slowing them. Ironic, the queen who funded the crusade gets scapegoated. They reach Antioch, ruled by her uncle Raymond. Whispers of incest, medieval tabloids at work. Louis drags her away. Their marriage crumbles. Eleanor's pain, annulment, but she rebounds, marries Henry II, births kings. Absurd resilience. Women in battle? Rare, but real. At the siege of Damascus, women haul stones, pour boiling oil. One anecdote, a Turkish emir shot by a Frankish woman archer. She taunts him post-mortem. Sarcasm in survival. Take that, infidel. But the dark side, prostitution booms in camps. Daughters of the pilgrimage, they're called, euphemism for necessity. Church condemns, but ignores the hunger driving it. Let's delve deeper into the absurdity of daily life. Hygiene, non-existent. Women deal with menstruation using rags, in heat that breeds infection. Childbirth on campaign, mortality sky high. No antibiotics, a cut festers, you're done. And the spiritual pain, confessing sins to priests who might prey on you. Indulgences promised, but for women, salvation feels distant amid the gore. Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. Richard the Lionheart, Philip Augustus, Frederick Barbarossa. Women. Berengaria of Navarre marries Richard en route, but he's more into fighting Saladin. She waits in Acre, besieged. The siege of Acre. 2 years of hell. Women inside starve, eat rats. Crusaders outside catapult diseased corpses over walls. Biological warfare, medieval style. When Acre falls, Richard massacres 2,700 prisoners, including women and children. The irony, chivalry dies here. Saladin's sister allegedly pleads for mercy, denied. But Saladin's side? Women like Ismat ad-Din Khatun, his sister-in-law, poet and diplomat, or the female warriors in folklore, Though exaggerated, some fought. Pain of loss, mothers mourning sons, wives turned widows overseeing estates amid chaos. Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, the absurd detour. Meant for Egypt, ends sacking Constantinople. Women in the Byzantine court, empresses scheming like Alexios III's wife Euphrosyne. But the Crusaders rape and pillage, nuns violated in convents. Survival? Fleeing with relics or submitting? Ironic, Christians crusading against Christians. Later crusades fade, but women's roles persist. St. Louis's Ninth Crusade, 1270, his wife Margaret of Provence rules France in his absence. She negotiates, raises funds, but Louis dies, more widows. Throughout, the harem myth, Western fantasies of exotic enslavement. Reality, harsh, captured women converted, married off, or worked to death. Some, like Constance of Antioch, play politics, marries Raymond of Poitiers, then Renaud de Chatillon, notorious brute. Absurd historical footnotes, women disguising as men to fight, like in the legend of Florine of Burgundy, though fictional, or real. Ida of Austria joins crusade, captured, refuses ransom to stay with lover. Romantic idiocy ends in death. The pain of survival, disease, plague, malaria ravage camps. Women nurse the sick, catch it themselves. No rights, inheritance laws favor men, leaving widows destitute unless noble. Sarcastic twist, crusades, empowered some women, regents like Sibylla of Jerusalem, crowns herself Queen 1186, but her reign? Disaster leads to Hatton. Horns of Hatton, 1187, Saladin crushes Guy de Lusignan. Women in Jerusalem prepare defense, Melisandre's legacy. They cut hair to make bowstrings, melt jewelry for coins. Saladin takes Jerusalem mercifully. No massacre, ransoms negotiable. But poor women? Sold into slavery. Ironic mercy compared to Christian brutality. As we wrap this first dive, remember, these women weren't side characters. They were the backbone, enduring absurd holy wars with grit and groans. The Crusades? A dark comedy of errors, where faith met folly, and survival was the punchline. What's your take? Did women get the short end, or were they the unsung MVPs? Comment below, subscribe for part 2, where we unearth more madness. Stay tuned, the nightmare deepens. Alright, strap in for round 2 of our wild ride through the dark, absurd, and downright brutal truth of women in the Crusades. If you thought the First Crusade was a chaotic mess, wait till we unpack the next chapter of this medieval madness. Picture this. It's a world where holy zeal meets logistical nightmares, where women dodge swords, starvation, and sexism while somehow keeping the show running. Missed part 1? Go back and watch. Trust me, you need the context for this train wreck, and here's your hook. Ever wonder how women survived when knights, kings, and even gods seemed to abandon them? Stick around for tales of cunning, courage, and some seriously dark humor. Drop a comment. What's the wildest survival story you've heard from history? Let's dive into the chaos. The Second Crusade flops like a bad sequel, 1147 to 1149, and women are still in the thick of it, navigating a world where divine promises crash hard against reality. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany lead this disaster, spurred by the fall of Edessa in 1144 to Zengi, the Muslim warlord who's basically the medieval equivalent of a final boss. Europe's freaking out. Edessa was the first Crusader state to crumble, and the Pope's like, round 2, let's go. Enter the women, from queens to camp followers, who face the same old horrors, starvation, betrayal, and the kind of irony that makes you wonder if history is just trolling us. Let's zoom in on Eleanor of Aquitaine again, because she's the rock star of this mess. She's not just tagging along with Louis, she's funding half the crusade with her Aquitaine wealth. Picture her riding into Constantinople, dazzling the Byzantine court with her entourage, dressed in silks that scream, I'm here to slay, literally and figuratively. But the Byzantines, led by Emperor Manuel I, are side-eyeing these Western barbarians. Eleanor's charisma, a threat, her husband's jealousy, a ticking bomb. The march south through Anatolia is where it gets grim. Turkish ambushes hit hard at Mount Cadmus, 1148. The baggage train, laden with Eleanor's fancy tents and wine, slows the army. Louis blames her because, of course, the guy who planned this fiasco needs a scapegoat. Ironic, right? The queen bankrolling the Holy War gets dragged for bringing her wardrobe. Women in the ranks, though, they're not sipping wine. Take Agnes, a fictional but typical weaver from Lyon, who joined with her brother. She's hauling water, patching wounds, and dodging arrows. The Turks don't discriminate. Women get cut down or captured. Those taken face slavery or worse. Some are sold in Damascus markets, others forced into marriages. Agnes, if she's lucky, learns a few Arabic phrases to barter for food. If not, she's bargaining with her body to avoid starvation. Chroniclers like William of Tyre hint at this grim trade, cloaked in pious disgust. The pain's real. No sanitation, no medicine, just dysentery and despair. Women use rags for everything. Bandages, menstruation, you name it. Infection's a death sentence, and childbirth, a gamble with the devil. The siege of Damascus, 1148, is the Crusades' big flop. Crusaders camp outside, expecting a quick win. Nope. Nur ad-Din's forces outsmart them, and supplies run dry. Women forage in orchards under sniper fire, picking fruit while praying not to get skewered. One story, probably apocryphal but too good to skip, tells of a woman who lobs a rock from a makeshift sling, knocking out a Turkish soldier. She's cheering until an arrow finds her. Survival's a cruel comedian. 1 second you're a hero, the next a corpse. The crusade collapses. Louis and Eleanor limp back to France, their marriage in tatters. Eleanor's like, I'm done, gets an annulment, and marries Henry II of England. Talk about a glow-up amidst the gloom. But let's talk Outremer, the Crusader states, where women are carving out lives in a war zone. Noble women like Melisande of Jerusalem are running the show. Melisand's co-ruling with her son Baldwin III by the 1150s, but he's itching to sideline her. She's no pushover, secures allies, fortifies Jerusalem, and even negotiates with Muslim emirs when needed. Her court's a melting pot, Frankish knights, Armenian merchants, Arab spies. She's playing 4D chess while Baldwin's throwing tantrums. The absurdity? She's ruling a kingdom founded on holy war, yet half her job is diplomacy with the enemy. Pain? Her daughter Sibylla's disastrous marriages later tanked the kingdom. Spoiler for part 3, it's a mess. Peasant women in Outremer? They're the backbone, working fields, markets, and sometimes brothels. The Latin East is a cultural blender. Greek, Arab, Frankish, and women adapt or die. Take Fatima, a Christian convert from a captured village. She's married to a Frankish soldier, learns to cook flatbread and curry favor with local traders. But raids by Zengid forces mean constant fear. Her village burns. She's widowed, now fending off lecherous knights who see her as fair game. Ironic, the Holy Land offers no sanctuary. Some women turn spy, passing intel to Muslim or Christian sides for a coin or a chance to live. Survival's a hustle, and morality's a luxury. The Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, cranks up the stakes. Saladin's victory at Hattin in 1187 wipes out Jerusalem's army, and the Holy City falls. Women in Jerusalem, led by Queen Sibylla, cut their hair for bowstrings and melt heirlooms for coin. Saladin's merciful, sort of. He allows ransoms, but poor women, straight to slavery or worse. One account describes a mother selling her daughter to save her son. Heartbreaking math of survival. Meanwhile, Richard the Lionheart's charging in, with Berengaria of Navarre as his new bride. She's stuck in Acre during the siege, 1189 to 1191, while Richard plays war hero. Inside Acre, women starve, eating leather and rats. Outside, Crusaders catapult corpses. Yes, corpses over walls. Biological warfare, medieval style. The smell, unimaginable. The pain, women nursing dying children while dodging dysentery. Berengaria's role, symbolic. She's the queen, but Richard's too busy negotiating with Saladin or executing 2,700 prisoners, including women, after Acre falls. The irony drips, chivalry's a myth when your king's a butcher. Saladin's side has women too. Ismat ad-Din Khatun, his sister-in-law, writes poetry and brokers deals. Muslim women in camps nurse wounded, smuggle supplies. Some, per legend, fight. though chroniclers exaggerate for drama. A woman named Isa, supposedly a bow-wielding widow, takes out a crusader before vanishing into folklore. Truth or tale, it's the kind of absurd defiance that defines these women. Daily life's a grind. Women in crusader camps deal with lice, scurvy, and leering soldiers. No privacy, latrines are ditches, baths a dream. Menstruation? Rags again, reused till they're stiff. Childbirth's a killer. Midwives use herbs and prayers, but sepsis doesn't care. Spiritual pain hits hard. Priests promise salvation, but excommunicate women for sins like prostitution born of hunger. The church's irony, preaching charity while judging the desperate. And the Fourth Crusade? Oh, it's a doozy, 1202 to 1204. Meant for Egypt, it veers to sack Constantinople, a Christian city. Women in the Byzantine capital face horrors. Nuns raped in convents, noble women like Euphrosyne, wife of Alexios III, scrambling to save relics or themselves. Crusaders loot, burn, and worse. A Venetian chronicler notes women fleeing with babies only to be cut down. Survival means hiding in sewers or swearing allegiance to the invaders. The absurdity, a holy war turning on its own faith. Pain, entire lineages wiped out, with women bearing the brunt. Back in Outremer, women like Isabella of Jerusalem navigate political quicksand. Married 4 times by 30, she's a pawn in dynastic games, yet claws her way to influence. Her daughter Maria, married off young, dies in childbirth. The cycle's brutal. Peasant women, meanwhile, face Bedouin raids. Captured, they're sold in Aleppo or Damascus. Some convert, assimilate, others resist, die. A few, like the semi-mythical Layla, allegedly rise in harems whispering in sultans' ears. Power? Maybe. Pain? Always. Disease is the silent killer. Malaria, plague, typhoid, no one's spared. Women nurse the sick, catch it themselves. No hospitals, just tents, prayers, and maybe a leech or two. Absurd treatments, bleeding for fever, amulets for plague. Survival's a lottery, and women rarely win. The sarcasm in all this? The Crusades promise glory, but women get grit. They're not just victims. Some wield swords, others words. Take Hodirna of Tripoli, mediating between her husband and Saladin's envoys, or the unnamed archer at Acre, taunting foes till her last breath. Yet history buries them, favoring knights and kings. As we close part 2, the dark truth screams. Women were the unsung survivors, outwitting absurdity, enduring pain. The Crusades? A cosmic joke where faith fueled folly and women paid the price. What's your take? Were these women warriors, victims, or both? Comment below, hit subscribe for part 3, where the madness escalates. Stay tuned, the nightmare's not over. Here we go, diving headfirst into part 3 of the dark, twisted, and oh-so-absurd truth about women in the Crusades. If you thought the last 2 parts were a wild ride, brace yourself. This one's a fever dream of betrayal, bloodshed, and women who somehow keep standing amidst the chaos. Missed parts 1 and 2? Pause now, go back, and catch up, because this medieval madness only gets crazier. Here's your hook. What happens when the so-called holy wars turn into a circus of greed, desperation, and female defiance? Stick around for stories that'll make you laugh, cry, and question humanity's sanity. Drop a comment. What's the most shocking thing you've learned about the Crusades so far? Let's unravel this nightmare together. The Third Crusade's aftermath lingers like a bad hangover, but the show must go on. It's the late 12th century, and the Crusader states are hanging on by a thread. Saladin's still out there, a master strategist making the Franks look like amateurs. Jerusalem's lost, Acre's a war zone, and women? They're not just surviving, they're scheming, fighting, and sometimes outshining the men who claim the spotlight. Let's talk about the noble women first, because they're playing a high-stakes Game of Thrones in a land where the throne's more like a wobbly stool. Sibylla of Jerusalem, queen and disaster magnet, takes center stage. By 1187, after the Horns of Hattin wipes out the Christian army, she's leading Jerusalem's defense. Picture her rallying the city, women and men alike, as Saladin's forces close in. They're melting jewelry for coins, tearing cloth for bandages, and praying like their lives depend on it, because they do. Sibylla negotiates surrender terms with Saladin, who's surprisingly chill for a guy who just crushed an army. He allows ransoms, but here's the kicker. Noble women like Sibylla might scrape by, but the poor, sold into slavery or left to rot. One chronicler describes a woman trading her infant for a loaf of bread. Survival's math is brutal, and the answer is always pain. Sibylla's story doesn't end well. She crowns her husband, Guy de Lusignan, king, but he's a walking PR nightmare. Loses at Hattin, gets captured, released, and still manages to tank her reign. By 1190, Sibylla and her daughters die of disease in Acre's siege camp. Ironic, isn't it? The queen who held Jerusalem falls to fever, not a sword. Her sister Isabella steps up, married off at 17 to Humphrey IV of Torn, then divorced and wed to Conrad of Montferrat to secure alliances. Isabella's life is a medieval soap opera. 4 husbands by 30, each marriage a political chess move. She's crowned queen in 1192, but her power is a mirage, controlled by men like Richard the Lionheart and Saladin's diplomats. The pain? She's a pawn in her own kingdom. The absurdity? She's still outmaneuvering half the knights around her. Let's shift to the women on the ground, the ones history barely bothers to name. Picture Marie, a baker's widow from Normandy, who joined the Third Crusade with her son, hoping for salvation. The march to Jaffa, 1191, is a death trap. Saladin's archers pick off stragglers, and the sun's cooking everyone alive. Marie's hauling grain sacks, dodging scorpions, and bartering her last copper for water. The camp's a cesspool. Dysentery's rampant, fleas are a fashion statement, and women like her are patching wounds with herbs that might as well be weeds. Childbirth on the road? A coin toss between life and death. One account mentions a woman giving birth during a skirmish, hiding in a ditch while arrows fly. She survives, the baby doesn't. The sarcasm drips, fighting for God's land, but God's not sending diapers. The siege of Jaffa, 1192, is a microcosm of this madness. Richard's holding the city barely against Saladin's relentless attacks. Women inside aren't just praying, they're hauling stones to repair walls, boiling oil to pour on attackers. A Muslim chronicler, Baha ad-Din, notes a Frankish woman firing a crossbow from the ramparts, dropping a soldier before taking an arrow herself. Her last words? A taunt, probably. That's the spirit, defiant, absurd, and doomed. Meanwhile, camp followers, women who cook, sew, or sell their bodies to survive, face the same risks as soldiers, minus the glory. The church calls them sinners, but when your choice is starve or sin, morality's a luxury. Speaking of sin, let's talk the Fourth Crusade, because it's the ultimate plot twist. Launched in 1202, it's supposed to hit Egypt, reclaim Jerusalem, you know, the usual. Instead, it veers off to sack Constantinople, a Christian city, in 1204. Talk about missing the mark. Women in Constantinople, noble women, nuns, merchants, face a nightmare. Crusaders, led by Venetians and Franks, loot churches, burn homes, and worse. A Byzantine source, Nikitas Choniets, describes nuns raped in convents, their relics smashed. Euphrosyne, wife of Emperor Alexios III, tries to flee with her daughters, clutching gold and icons. They're caught. She's ransomed, but her daughters? Married off to Crusader lords or sold. The irony's thick, a holy war turning on its own faith, with women as collateral damage. Peasant women in Constantinople fare worse. Imagine Anna, a fictional fishmonger's wife. Her home's torched, her husband's dead, and she's hiding in a cellar with her kids, praying the drunken knights pass by. They don't. Survival means blending into the chaos, maybe swearing allegiance to the Latin Empire that rises from the ashes. Some women do. Others flee to Nicaea or Trebizond, carrying stories of betrayal. The pain's generational. Families shattered, futures stolen. The absurdity? Crusaders justify it as God's will, while pocketing Byzantine gold. Back in Outremer, the Crusader states are crumbling. The Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221, aims for Egypt, targeting Damietta. Women join the march, from noble ladies like Maria of Jerusalem to camp followers like Aisha, a converted Muslim now serving a Frankish lord. Damietta's siege is hell. 2 years of mud, malaria, and starvation. Women nurse the wounded, drag corpses to mass graves, and dodge Nile crocodiles while fetching water. Yes, crocodiles. Nature's like, you thought Turks were the problem? When Damietta falls in 1219, Crusaders loot, but the victory's short-lived. Al-Kamil, Saladin's nephew, floods the Nile, trapping the army. Women wade through muck, carrying kids or supplies, only to surrender in 1221. The lucky ones return home. Others end up in Cairo's slave markets. The Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229, is weirdly peaceful. Emperor Frederick II negotiates with Al-Kamil, regaining Jerusalem without a fight. Women like Isabella II, queen and child bride, are pawns in this deal, married to Frederick at 13 to cement his claim. She dies at 17, childbirth again. The sarcasm writes itself. A holy city won by words, but women still lose to biology. Meanwhile, peasant women in Jerusalem rebuild lives, markets, bakeries, brothels, only to face new raids when the treaty expires. The Seventh Crusade, 1248 to 1254, led by Louis IX of France, is another Egyptian misadventure. His wife, Margaret of Provence, is the unsung hero. While Louis leads the charge on Damietta, Margaret's back in Acre, pregnant, managing logistics. When Louis is captured in 1250 at Mansoura, she's in Damietta, giving birth as the city's besieged. Picture this: Margaret, postpartum, negotiating with Italian merchants to pay Louis's ransom, while Saracen forces circle. She pulls it off, saves the king, and sails home. The irony? Louis gets a sainthood, Margaret gets a footnote. Her pain? Watching her husband's crusade obsession bankrupt France. Muslim women too shine in defiance. Shajar al-Dur, a former slave, rises to sultana in Egypt by 1250, ruling after her husband's death. She orchestrates resistance against Louis, proving women on both sides play hardball. Her story's a rare win, until she's murdered in a power struggle. Absurd, right? Power one day, a corpse the next. Daily life remains a grind. Women in crusader camps face scurvy, smallpox, and soldiers who see them as spoils. Hygiene's a myth. Menstruation means reusing filthy rags, infections guaranteed. Childbirth's a killer. Midwives wield knives for C-sections, no anesthesia. Spiritual pain cuts deeper. Priests sell indulgences but shun fallen women who turn to prostitution to eat. The church's hypocrisy is peak medieval. Preach love, judge the desperate. Absurd tales pepper the era. Take the legend of Eleanor the warrior, a noble woman said to don armor and fight at Ascalon, 1153. Likely fiction, but inspired by real women like the archer at Jaffa, or the nun who smuggles relics from Constantinople, only to be caught and exiled. Survival's a tightrope. One misstep, you're done. Disease is relentless. Plague, leprosy, malaria. Women nurse the sick, knowing they'll likely catch it. Treatments? Bloodletting, charms, and prayers that don't work. The sarcasm's unavoidable. Crusade for salvation, die of a cough. As we wrap part 3, the dark truth is clear. Women were the glue holding this chaos together, from queens like Margaret to nameless widows like Marie. The Crusades? A tragic comedy where faith fueled failure and women bore the scars. What's your take? Were these women the real heroes? Comment below, subscribe for part 4, where we close this saga. The nightmare's almost over, but the twists keep coming. Welcome to the grand finale of our wild, grim, and absurdly ironic journey through the dark truth of women in the Crusades. If you've made it through parts 1, 2, and 3, you're a warrior yourself. Congrats on surviving the medieval madness. If you haven't, hit pause and catch up, because this last chapter ties up the chaos with a blood-soaked bow. Here's your hook. Ever wonder how women kept defying the odds when the Crusades turned into a centuries-long disaster? Brace for tales of grit, betrayal, and a finale that'll leave you stunned. Drop a comment. What's the most insane thing you've learned about these women so far? Let's close this nightmare with a bang. The Crusades are limping toward their end by the late 13th century, but the pain, absurdity, and female resilience, still going strong. The Seventh Crusade fizzled out in 1254, with Louis IX of France licking his wounds and Margaret of Provence proving she's the real MVP. But the dream of reclaiming Jerusalem refuses to die, dragging women, nobles, peasants, and everyone in between into its final, futile acts. The Crusader states are crumbling, the Mamluks are rising, and the Holy War is starting to feel like a cosmic prank. Let's dive into the last gasps of Outremer and the women who faced the endgame. Start with the noble women, because they're juggling crowns and catastrophes. Take Alice of Champagne, regent of Jerusalem in the 1240s. She's ruling for her nephew, Conrad IV, while the kingdom's a mess. Khwarezmian Turks raid in 1244, allied with Egypt's Ayyubids, and Jerusalem falls again. Alice negotiates with everyone, Franks, Muslims, even the Mongols sniffing around the edges. She's playing diplomat in a war zone, but the irony? Her power's tied to a kid king who's never set foot in the Holy Land. The pain's real, her son dies young, her alliances fray, and she's sidelined by 1246. Yet she keeps scheming, marrying off relatives to secure shaky thrones. It's absurd, a queen fighting for a kingdom that's basically a sandcastle at high tide. Then there's Isabella of Armenia, ruling Cilician Armenia, an allied Christian state in the 1250s. She's caught between Mamluks, Mongols, and Crusader politics. Her marriage to Hatum Urum is a strategic move, but when Mongols demand submission, she's the one brokering peace, offering tributes to keep her people alive. The sarcasm drips, crusade for Christ, but bow to Genghis Khan's heirs to survive. Her daughter Maria gets betrothed to a Crusader lord, only to die in childbirth. Another grim reminder that biology's as deadly as any sword. Now, the women on the ground. Picture Beatrice, a fictional tanner's wife from Acre, joining the 8th Crusade in 1270 with her merchant husband. Louis IX is back, this time targeting Tunis. The march is a slog, scorching heat, bad water, and dysentery that hits like a biblical plague. Beatrice's job, tending campfires, mending tunics, and bartering for grain in markets where prices are sky high. Tunis's siege is a disaster. Disease wipes out half the army, including Louis. Beatrice's husband catches fever. She's nursing him, knowing it's hopeless. When the crusade collapses, she's widowed, stuck in a foreign port, and forced to sell her labor, maybe her body, to get passage home. The irony? The holy mission leaves her praying for survival, not salvation. The 9th Crusade, 1271 to 1272, led by England's Edward I, is the last hurrah. He lands in Acre, the final Crusader stronghold. Women like Beatrice are everywhere, running markets, tending wounded, dodging Mamluk raids. Edward's sister, Margaret, joins him briefly, a symbolic figurehead, but the real work falls to locals. Armenian women weaving nets for catapults, Syrian Christians smuggling food past blockades. One story, likely exaggerated, tells of a woman named Sarah who poisons a Mamluk scout's water, saving a garrison. Heroic? Sure. Absurd? She's executed when caught, her sacrifice barely a footnote. Acre's fall in 1291 is the death knell. The Mamluks, led by Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, besiege the city. Women fight alongside men, nuns wield crossbows, merchants' wives hurl stones. The Templar fortress holds out longest, but when it falls, the slaughter's indiscriminate. A chronicler, Thaddeus of Naples, describes women and children herded into ships for slavery or ransom. Some, like a noble woman named Lucia, bribe their way out, selling heirlooms for passage to Cyprus. Others, chained in Damascus markets. The pain's visceral, families torn apart, lives erased. The absurdity? 2 centuries of crusading, and it ends in a bloodbath, with women bearing the worst. Muslim women, too, play their part. Zainab, a fictional healer in Damascus, tends Mamluk wounded, using herbs and cauterization, medieval medicine at its grimmest. She's respected, but when crusaders raid nearby villages, her sisters are captured, forced into servitude. Some Muslim women rise, like Shajar al-Durr's legacy in Egypt. Her rule in 1250 inspires others, though few reach her heights. Most grind through life, weaving, trading, or spying for survival. A tale from Cairo. A woman smuggles intel to Mamluks, posing as a washerwoman, only to be betrayed by a jealous rival. Her fate? Public execution. The sarcasm's thick. Risk everything for your side, get repaid with a noose. Daily life's a brutal slog. Women in Acre's final days face starvation, eating shoe leather, drinking rainwater mixed with ash. Hygiene's a distant memory. Menstruation means scavenging for rags, infections inevitable. Childbirth? A death sentence half the time. Midwives use prayers and knives, but sepsis doesn't negotiate. Spiritual pain cuts deepest. Priests promise paradise but excommunicate women for sins like stealing bread to feed kids. The church's hypocrisy is peak medieval. Preach mercy, condemn the desperate. Disease is the silent reaper. Plague, smallpox, and scurvy ravage camps. Women nurse the dying, knowing they're next. Treatments are absurd. Amulets, bleeding, or chanting psalms over festering wounds. One woman, per a hospitaler record, survives leprosy only to die of malaria. The irony? She outlasted knights only to lose to a mosquito. Absurd tales abound. A legend from Cyprus, post-Acre, tells of Joanna the Blade, a woman who disguises as a man to join the Templars' last stand. She's caught, not for her gender, but for stealing wine to bribe a ship captain for escape. Fiction or not, it captures the spirit. Women bending rules to survive. Or take the nun in Tripoli who hides relics in her robes, only to be sold as a concubine when the city falls in 1289. Her faith? Useless against human greed. The Crusades' end doesn't mean peace. Cyprus becomes a refuge, but women there, widows, orphans, exiles, face new struggles. Noble women like Maria of Antioch sell claims to lost thrones, scraping by as courtiers. Peasants like Beatrice, if they make it, work docks or taverns, dodging pirates and plague. Some turn to piracy themselves. Folklore mentions a lady of Limassol who raids Muslim ships, a rare win in a losing game. The dark truth? Women were the backbone of this disaster, from queens like Alice to healers like Zainab. They schemed, fought, and survived where men faltered. The Crusades promised glory but delivered gore, and women paid the price, widowed, enslaved, or erased. The absurdities in the contrast, holy wars for a divine cause, yet human cruelty stole the show. The pains in the details, risks every childbirth death, every ransom unpaid, every life ground down by a dream that never materialized. So, what's the legacy? History buries these women, favoring knights and kings, but their stories, gritty, defiant, heartbreaking, prove they were the real warriors. The Crusades were a tragic comedy, a centuries-long fever dream where faith fueled folly, and women's resilience shone through the cracks. What's your take? Did these women redefine heroism, or were they history's forgotten casualties? Comment below, smash that like button, and share this series with anyone who loves a good historical gut punch. Thanks for sticking with us through the nightmare. The Crusades are over, but their echoes linger, especially for the women who lived it. So, you think you know the story of the Conquistadors, brave men in fancy helmets, planting flags and spreading the good word of God, all while collecting a few shiny souvenirs for the Spanish crown. It's a tale that's been polished and presented in history books for centuries, a heroic epic of discovery and destiny. Well, let me tell you, that story is about as accurate as a 16th century map drawn by a man who's been at sea for 6 months with nothing but salted pork and his own dwindling sanity for company. The reality, my friends, is a whole lot messier, a whole lot dumber, and infinitely more horrifying. Let's start with the men themselves. Who were these so-called conquerors? Were they the best and brightest Spain had to offer? The SEAL Team 6 of the Renaissance? Not exactly. Think of them more as the guys who couldn't get a decent job back home. They were a motley crew of third-born sons with no inheritance, disgraced soldiers, bankrupt merchants, and a healthy sprinkling of actual criminals. These weren't men with a grand vision of a new world order. These were men who were hoping to get rich quick and maybe, just maybe, not die of dysentery in the process. Their primary motivation wasn't God or glory, it was gold, and they were willing to do some truly spectacularly awful things to get it. Imagine the sales pitch from the likes of Hernán Cortés or Francisco Pizarro. It probably went something like this. Hey, are you tired of being a peasant? Do you enjoy long, uncomfortable boat rides with a high probability of scurvy? Do you have a flexible moral compass and a deep-seated desire to stab people for their shiny possessions? Then have I got an opportunity for you. We're sailing to a land filled with untold riches, where the streets are paved with gold and the natives are just dying to meet us. Literally. It was the 16th century equivalent of a multi-level marketing scheme, and a whole lot of desperate men signed up. And so they set sail, packed into wooden ships that were basically floating petri dishes of disease and despair. The journey across the Atlantic was no Caribbean cruise. It was a brutal, months-long ordeal of cramped quarters, rotten food, and the constant gnawing fear of falling off the edge of the world. And for what? For the promise of a paradise that existed only in their greed-addled imaginations. When they finally did make landfall, they weren't greeted by a welcoming committee with fruit baskets. They were met by civilizations that had been thriving for centuries, with complex societies, advanced agriculture, and their own very different ideas about property rights. The Aztecs, the Incas, the Maya. These were not simple, primitive tribes waiting to be discovered. They were empires with cities larger and cleaner than many in Europe at the time. But our intrepid conquistadors, in their infinite wisdom, didn't see any of that. They saw gold. They saw souls to be saved, which was a convenient euphemism for enslaved. And they saw a whole lot of people who were unfortunately not immune to European diseases. Let's talk about the secret weapon of the conquest, the one that did more damage than any sword or cannon: germs. The conquistadors brought with them a delightful cocktail of smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which the native populations had absolutely no immunity. It was a biological apocalypse. Entire cities were wiped out before a single Spaniard had even set foot in them. It's estimated that up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died from disease in the first century after Columbus. 90%. Let that sink in for a moment. That's not a conquest. That's a plague of biblical proportions, delivered by a handful of men who probably didn't even wash their hands after going to the bathroom. And the ones who didn't die from disease were often subjected to a fate that was arguably worse. The Spanish had a nifty little system called the encomienda, which was basically a feudal system on steroids. In theory, it was supposed to be a way to protect the natives and teach them the ways of Christianity. In practice, it was a brutal system of forced labor that was indistinguishable from slavery. The natives were forced to work in mines and on plantations, often until they dropped dead from exhaustion. Their land was taken, their culture was suppressed, and their gods were declared to be demons. And what about the glorious battles we've all seen in the movies? The handful of brave Spaniards holding off a horde of screaming natives? Well, there's a grain of truth to that, but it's not the whole story. The Spanish did have some technological advantages, of course. They had steel swords, armor, and horses, which were terrifying to people who had never seen them before, but they were also vastly outnumbered. Cortés had a few hundred men when he marched on the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, a city of over 200,000 people. Pizarro had less than 200 men when he took on the entire Inca Empire. So how did they do it? Well, it wasn't just through military prowess. They were also incredibly lucky and incredibly ruthless. They were masters of a strategy that would be familiar to any student of history: divide and conquer. They exploited existing rivalries and resentments between different native groups, turning them against each other. In Mexico, Cortés allied himself with the Tlaxcalans, who were bitter enemies of the Aztecs. In Peru, Pizarro took advantage of a civil war that was already raging within the Inca Empire. The conquistadors didn't conquer the New World on their own. They had a lot of help from the people who were already living there. And let's not forget the sheer, unadulterated treachery of it all. The story of Pizarro and the Inca Emperor Atahualpa is a masterclass in backstabbing. Pizarro invited Atahualpa to a meeting, then ambushed him and took him prisoner. He demanded a massive ransom for Atahualpa's release, a room filled with gold and 2 rooms filled with silver. The Incas paid it. And what did Pizarro do? He had Atahualpa executed anyway. It was a move so cold-blooded, so utterly devoid of honor, that it would make a Game of Thrones character blush. This was the reality of the conquest. It wasn't a heroic epic. It was a brutal, bloody, and often bafflingly stupid chapter in human history. It was a story of greed, disease, and betrayal on a continental scale. And it was all driven by a handful of men who were more interested in filling their pockets than in building a new world. So, the next time you see a statue of a conquistador looking all noble and heroic, take a closer look. See the desperation in his eyes, the greed in his heart, and the trail of death and destruction he left in his wake. Because that's the real story of the conquest. It's not a story of heroes, it's a story of villains. And it's a story that we're still grappling with today. What do you think? Was it a necessary evil for the world we live in now, or a crime against humanity that we should never forget? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're still with me, get ready for part 2, where we'll dive even deeper into the madness, the cruelty, and the sheer unadulterated absurdity of the Spanish conquest. It's going to be a wild ride. Alright, welcome back to the historical train wreck, you magnificent connoisseurs of catastrophe. In part 1, we established that our heroic conquistadors were less like noble explorers and more like the universe's most disastrously successful pyramid scheme, armed with smallpox and a complete lack of basic human decency. They'd arrived, they'd coughed on everyone, and they'd managed to topple empires through a combination of dumb luck, ruthless betrayal, and exploiting local politics like a meddling celestial house guest. But now that the initial shock and awe campaign was over, the real work could begin. The meticulous, soul-crushing, and often mind-bogglingly stupid process of actually running their new ill-gotten gains. Their primary objective, the sun around which their entire miserable existence orbited, was gold. Not just a healthy desire for wealth, mind you. This was a fever, a rabid, frothing-at-the-mouth obsession that made them see shimmering cities of gold around every corner. They were like cartoon prospectors, their eyes turning into dollar signs, except their pickaxes were swords and their jackasses were the enslaved native populations. This wasn't just about economics, it was a pathology. This led them on some of the most ludicrously doomed expeditions in human history, all in search of myths and legends. The most famous, of course, was El Dorado, the Golden Man. The story went that somewhere, deep in the jungle, there was a king who covered himself in gold dust and chucked emeralds into a sacred lake for fun. To the Spanish, this wasn't a beautiful ritual, it was a cosmic injustice. A king using gold for ceremonies instead of melting it into bars and shipping it back to pay off Spain's war debts. The audacity. And so they plunged into the Amazon rainforest, a place that actively tries to kill you on a molecular level. Imagine you're a guy from the arid plains of Extremadura, Spain. Your idea of a dangerous animal is a slightly angry bull. Now, you're in a place where the insects can drink your blood through your boots, the fish can swim up your urethra, and the plants themselves are locked in a chemical arms race to see which one can poison you the fastest. Gonzalo Pizarro, Francisco's even nastier brother, led one such expedition. He dragged along thousands of native porters, who, of course, bore the brunt of the suffering. They marched for months, eating their own dogs, then their horses. They boiled their leather saddles for a bit of protein. All the while, the jungle just swallowed them. Men disappeared, claimed by jaguars, disease, or simply the crushing despair of it all. They found no El Dorado. What they found was starvation, madness, and a very, very long walk home for the handful of survivors. It was a colossal, expensive, and deadly failure, all driven by a campfire story. And what happened when they did find treasure? Did they appreciate the incredible artistry, the centuries of cultural heritage poured into every piece of Aztec or Incan metalwork? Don't be ridiculous. To the conquistadors, a golden pendant intricately shaped like a hummingbird wasn't a masterpiece of metallurgy. It was just an inefficiently shaped ingot. They saw priceless works of art and thought, this is nice, but it would be much easier to stack if it were a brick. So they set up foundries and melted it all down. Lifelike golden masks, delicate silver llamas, intricate ceremonial objects that held deep religious and cultural significance. All of it was tossed into the furnace. It was the cultural equivalent of taking the Mona Lisa and burning it to warm your soup. They kept meticulous records, not of the art they were destroying, but of its weight. They weren't conquerors preserving a legacy. They were cosmic pawnbrokers, weighing the soul of a civilization on a grubby set of scales. To justify all this, they needed a moral framework, a way to sleep at night after a long day of plunder and massacre. And that's where the church came in, hand in bloody hand. Now, not every priest was a monster. We'll get to the exceptions later, but the institution as a whole provided the perfect ideological cover. The native people weren't fully human, you see. They were godless heathens in desperate need of salvation. And salvation, conveniently, looked a lot like forced labor and handing over all your valuables. This led to one of the most absurd and sinister pieces of legalese ever concocted, the requerimiento, the requirement. This was a document, a speech, that the conquistadors were legally obligated to read aloud to native populations before they attacked them. In Spanish, to people who had never heard Spanish. Imagine this. You're a farmer in a small village in the Andes. Suddenly, a group of terrifying, smelly men in metal clothing show up on giant, snorting beasts. One of them unrolls a scroll and starts yelling gibberish at you. Unbeknownst to you, he is informing you of the existence of a single true God, a pope in a faraway land, and the Spanish king to whom the pope has generously given your land. The speech concludes by saying that if you don't immediately accept all of this as truth and swear fealty, then it's your own fault when they enslave your family, steal your property, and run you through with a sword. The document explicitly states, "The deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault, and not that of their highnesses or ours, nor of these gentlemen who come with us." They would often read this from the deck of a ship to an empty coastline, or mumble it into their beards outside a village in the middle of the night just before they attacked. It was a cosmic "I'm not touching you" game, a bureaucratic absolution for genocide. It wasn't about communication, it was about covering your own administrative and spiritual backside. It is, without a doubt, one of the most darkly hilarious and horrifying documents in human history. But don't for a second think these conquistadors were a band of brothers, a unified force for Spanish glory. They were a viper's nest of ambition, jealousy, and backstabbing. They hated each other almost as much as they hated the people they were conquering. The moment the main enemy was defeated, they immediately turned on one another, fighting over the scraps like rabid dogs. The conquest of Peru is the perfect example. Francisco Pizarro and his partner Diego de Almagro had toppled the Inca Empire together. They were both old, ruthless, and fabulously wealthy as a result. Was that enough? Of course not. They immediately started a civil war over who got to be the governor of the city of Cusco. It was a pathetic geriatric squabble that engulfed the entire colony. Almagro was eventually captured and garroted by Pizarro's brother. A few years later, Almagro's vengeful son and his supporters stormed Pizarro's palace in Lima and hacked the old man to death. They stabbed him so many times that he allegedly used his final breath to paint a cross on the floor with his own blood. It was a soap opera written in blood and greed. These men who had conquered an empire couldn't even manage to share it. Their loyalty wasn't to Spain or to God or even to each other. It was only to their own insatiable avarice. They were the architects of a new world, but they were so busy trying to steal each other's blueprints that they damn near burned the whole construction site down. This constant infighting, this pathological obsession with gold, this veneer of religious and legal justification, it all created a system of almost unimaginable cruelty. The encomienda system, which we touched on before, wasn't just slavery light, it was a death sentence. The Spanish crown, sitting thousands of miles away, put laws in place to supposedly protect the natives. But on the ground, those laws were utterly meaningless. The local encomendero had absolute power of life and death. Men were sent on death marches to mines deep in the mountains, forced to carry impossible loads. They were given a handful of maize a week and worked until they collapsed. Women were taken from their families and forced into domestic servitude or worse. Children were put to work in fields, their small bodies broken by the labor. The Spanish didn't see them as people. They saw them as a resource, a biological fuel to be burned in the engine of their new economy, and that fuel was running out fast. The combination of disease and brutal overwork meant that the native population was in a state of catastrophic decline. In some areas, entire islands were completely depopulated within a single generation. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect of the conquest. It was the conquest. It wasn't a few bad apples, it was a rotten orchard. The search for El Dorado wasn't an adventure, it was a death cult. The melting of the gold wasn't just wastefulness, it was the physical manifestation of their contempt for an entire culture. And the whole bloody affair was sanctioned by a god they claimed to serve and a king they claimed to love. So, as we leave part 2, we see a world firmly in the grip of these petty tyrants. The great empires have fallen, not just to steel and germs, but to a profound and arrogant lack of imagination. The Spanish had found a world of wonders and had managed to see only its cash value. They had become kings of a graveyard, squabbling over tombstones, but a system this brutal cannot last forever without resistance. The survivors were watching, they were learning, and they were waiting. What do you think is the single most absurd moment in this whole sordid tale? The reading of the requerimiento to an empty beach, the boiling of saddles for food in a futile search for a golden king. Let me know your pick for the peak of conquistador stupidity in the comments, and brace yourselves for part 3, where we'll explore the sparks of rebellion and the voices of dissent that dared to speak out against this golden age of horror. So, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the story ends there. The great empires are shattered, the gold is being melted down, and the native populations are quietly getting on with the business of dying from smallpox or being worked to death in a mine. A neat, tragic, but ultimately finished story. But that's the funny thing about people. They generally don't enjoy being systematically enslaved and eradicated. It tends to put them in a rather foul mood. The Spanish may have won the opening act with a blitzkrieg of germs and steel, but they were about to discover that ruling a continent is a hell of a lot harder than breaking it. Welcome to the Age of Resistance, a period defined by bloody uprisings, spiritual warfare, and the surprising revelation that some of the Spanish conquerors actually possessed something resembling a conscience. Let's start with the most direct form of customer feedback: violent rebellion. The Spanish had installed puppet rulers in the ruins of the Aztec and Inca empires, assuming they could just pull the strings and watch the tribute roll in. This worked for a little while, until one of the puppets decided he'd rather be a real boy. His name was Manco Inca, a young Incan royal who the Spanish placed on the throne, thinking he'd be a pliable little tool. For a while, he played the part. He smiled, he nodded, he helped the Pizarro brothers fleece his own people. But all the while, he was taking notes. He was watching how they fought. He was learning their weaknesses. Then, in 1536, under the pretense of retrieving a golden statue for his masters, Manco Inca slipped away, rallied a massive army, and laid siege to the city of Cusco, the former Inca capital now occupied by a few hundred conquistadors. This wasn't just a skirmish, it was an all-out war. Manco's forces numbered in the tens, possibly hundreds of thousands. They rained down a storm of arrows, slung red-hot stones that set the city's thatched roofs on fire, and even learned to use captured Spanish weapons against their former owners. They had cavalry, for God's sake. They had learned to ride the terrifying beasts the Spanish had brought and turned them into instruments of their own liberation. The siege lasted for almost a year. The handful of Spanish defenders were trapped, starving, and terrified. For a moment, a single flickering moment, it looked like the Inca might actually win, that they might actually throw the invaders back into the sea, but it was not to be. A combination of Spanish reinforcements and the sheer logistical difficulty of feeding a massive army for that long eventually broke the siege. Manco Inca was forced to retreat into the remote mountain fortress of Vilcabamba, where he and his descendants would maintain an independent Neo-Inca state for another 36 years, a constant defiant thorn in the side of the Spanish Empire. The Spanish response to this uprising was, predictably, horrific. They began slaughtering native women to terrorize the rebels, a tactic of such profound cruelty it reveals the sheer panic they felt. They hadn't just conquered a people, they had created an enemy that would never ever forget, and the Incas weren't the only ones. All over the Americas, people fought back. The Spanish conquest of the Maya and the Yucatan Peninsula was a meat grinder that lasted for over 170 years. The Mayans weren't a single centralized empire like the Aztecs or Incas. They were a collection of city-states, and this decentralization made them an absolute nightmare to conquer. The Spanish would subdue one town, and the next one over would rise in rebellion. It was a brutal, thankless jungle war, with no clear front lines and no end in sight. But the undisputed world champions of resistance were the Mapuche people of what is now Chile. The Spanish, swaggering with the confidence of having toppled two empires, strolled into Mapuche territory expecting another easy victory. Instead, they walked into a buzzsaw. The Mapuche were not just fierce warriors, they were incredibly fast learners. They captured Spanish horses and became arguably the most brilliant horsemen on the continent. They developed new military tactics specifically to counter Spanish formations. They had leaders like Lautaro, a young man who had been a captive of the Spanish as a boy, and used his intimate knowledge of their methods to inflict devastating defeats upon them. The Arauco War, as it came to be known, lasted for centuries. The Mapuche fought the Spanish Empire to a bloody stalemate, maintaining their independence long after most other native groups had been subjugated. They were the Vietnam of the Spanish conquest, a constant bleeding ulcer on the imperial body. But resistance isn't always about swords and arrows. Sometimes the most powerful rebellion happens in the mind. The Spanish were not just after gold, they were after souls. The spiritual conquest was a top priority. They built churches on the ruins of temples, smashed idols, and declared the old gods to be demons. They thought they could simply erase thousands of years of culture and belief and replace it with their own. What happened instead was one of the most fascinating processes of cultural fusion and subversion in history: syncretism. The native people didn't abandon their gods, they just gave them new names and new faces. They looked at the Catholic pantheon of saints and saw reflections of their own deities. A saint associated with thunder might be secretly worshipped as the old thunder god. The Virgin Mary, a powerful and compassionate female figure, was often merged with indigenous mother goddesses. The most famous example of this is the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico. The story is that she appeared to an indigenous man, Juan Diego, on a hill that had once been the site of a major shrine to the Aztec mother goddess, Tonantzin. She spoke to him in his native Nahuatl language and had the features of a native woman. Was it a miracle? Or was it a genius act of cultural preservation, a way of keeping their most sacred beliefs alive under the very noses of their oppressors? This wasn't conversion, it was adaptation. It was a way of saying, we will take your God, but we will make him ours. We will pray in your church, but our prayers will have our own meaning. The spiritual conquest was, in many ways, a spectacular failure. The Spanish thought they were building a mirror of Spain. Instead, they had created something entirely new, a hybrid culture that was both Catholic and profoundly indigenous. And then there was the resistance that came from the most unexpected place of all, from within the Spanish system itself. Amidst all the sociopathic gold chasers and ruthless slavers, there were a few men who looked at what was happening and were horrified. The most prominent, the most thunderous voice of protest belonged to a Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas. And here's the kicker: Las Casas wasn't some starry-eyed idealist fresh off the boat. He had been a conquistador. He had owned an encomienda in the Caribbean, and had profited from the same slave labor he would later condemn. But then, he had a profound crisis of conscience. He saw the unimaginable cruelty, the casual disregard for human life, and he realized he was complicit in a mortal sin of historic proportions. He gave up his encomienda, became a priest, and dedicated the rest of his long life to fighting for the rights of the native peoples. He became their greatest champion, the whistleblower of the 16th century. He wrote a book that would shake the foundations of the Spanish Empire, a short account of the destruction of the Indies. It is a brutal, relentless, and utterly damning catalog of the atrocities he had witnessed. He describes massacres, torture, and the systematic working to death of entire populations in mines and on plantations. It was a polemic designed to shock and horrify the Spanish court, and it worked. The book became a bestseller across Europe and was eagerly translated by Spain's Protestant enemies, the English and the Dutch, who used it to create what became known as the Black Legend, a narrative of unique Spanish cruelty. While it was certainly propaganda, the legend was rooted in a horrific truth that Las Casas had dared to expose. His activism led to one of the most extraordinary events of the era, the Valladolid debate of 1550. The King of Spain actually paused the entire enterprise of conquest to hold a formal debate on a single question. Are the native peoples of the Americas fully human, with souls and rights, or are they, as the philosopher Aristotle had suggested, natural slaves? On one side was Las Casas, arguing passionately for their humanity. On the other was Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, a respected scholar who argued that the natives were barbarians who needed to be conquered for their own good. Think about that for a second. An empire at the peak of its power, pausing to have a public philosophical debate about the morality of its own existence. It's utterly surreal. The debate itself had no clear winner, and it certainly didn't stop the abuse overnight. But it was a landmark. It proved that there was no universal agreement on the justice of the conquest. The seed of doubt had been planted right in the heart of the empire. Las Casas and a few brave men like him showed that the Spanish conscience was not entirely dead. It was just buried under a very, very large pile of gold. So the picture of the New World in the mid-16th century is far more complex than a simple story of conquerors and victims. It's a chaotic, violent, and dynamic landscape. It's a world of ongoing wars, of hidden gods in Christian clothing, and of fierce moral debates raging in the courts of Europe. The Spanish had not created a stable empire. They had built a house on a volcano, and it was constantly trembling. They were fighting wars on multiple fronts, against the natives who refused to be broken, against the parts of their own souls that knew what they were doing was wrong, and, as we saw in part 2, against each other. All this chaos, all this bloodshed, all this moral turmoil, was it worth it? For Spain, the answer seemed obvious. An unprecedented river of silver and gold was now flowing from the mines of Peru and Mexico across the Atlantic. Spain was, without a doubt, the richest and most powerful nation in Europe. But wealth can be a poison, and this particular treasure came with a terrible curse. What do you think? Who were the most effective resistors? The warriors like Manco Inca, the cultural saboteurs who created syncretic religions, or the internal critics like Las Casas? Let me know which form of resistance you find most compelling in the comments, and get ready for our final part, where we'll follow the trail of blood-soaked treasure back to Spain and see what kind of empire it really built. You might be surprised. Alright, you've stuck with us through the initial invasion, the backstabbing, and the glimmers of rebellion. You've seen the sheer, bloody-minded chaos of it all. Now, for the final act, we follow the money. Because every drop of blood spilled, every culture shattered, every soul saved, was ultimately in service to one thing, generating a river of treasure to be funneled back across the ocean to Spain. And what did Mother Spain do with this unprecedented, world-altering windfall? Well, it did what any sensible lottery winner would do. It blew it all on vanity projects, got into fights with the neighbors, and ended up more broke and miserable than when it started. The source of this colossal fortune was not the chest of looted Aztec art. That was just seed money. The real jackpot lay deep within the earth, in the mountains of the conquered lands. The Spanish hit the motherlode, and the motherlode had a name, Potosi. Located in modern-day Bolivia, Potosi was a literal mountain of silver. It was the richest silver deposit in the history of humankind. The city that sprung up at its base became one of the largest and wealthiest in the world, a glittering, high-altitude metropolis of extreme opulence and even more extreme misery. A Spanish saying emerged, "To be worth a Potosi," meaning to be worth an unimaginable fortune. But this fortune was mined with human blood. The Spanish refined their system of forced labor, the mita, an old Inca practice they twisted into something monstrous. Every year, thousands of native men from hundreds of miles away were forced to leave their villages and march to Potosi to work in the mines. It was a death sentence. The conditions were hellish. Men worked in dark, narrow, suffocating tunnels, breathing in toxic dust and the poisonous fumes of mercury, which was used to extract the silver from the ore. They died from cave-ins, from lung disease, from sheer exhaustion. Potosi was not a city, it was an altar, and the Spanish were sacrificing thousands of lives a year to their god of silver. The mountain that eats men, they called it, and it had an insatiable appetite. From Potosi and from the silver mines of Mexico, a torrent of wealth began to flow. Once a year, the great Spanish treasure fleets would gather in the Caribbean. These were vast convoys of galleons, fat with silver bars and gold coins, the most tempting targets a pirate could ever dream of. They were protected by warships, and the entire system was a marvel of logistics. For over a century, this silver pipeline pumped the wealth of the Americas directly into the veins of Spain. Spain became, overnight, the richest and most powerful nation in Europe. The King of Spain had a bank account that would make a modern oligarch blush. He could afford to do anything, and he chose to do everything wrong. The first, most immediate effect of the silver tsunami was something we now call inflation. The Spanish king, flush with cash, started spending it. He paid his soldiers, built palaces, and bought all the fancy things a 16th century superpower could want. But all this new money flooding into the market without a corresponding increase in things to buy meant that prices for everything went up, and up, and up. This price revolution, as historians call it, ripped through Spain and then the rest of Europe. For the average Spanish peasant, this was a disaster. Their wages stayed the same, but a loaf of bread, a pair of shoes, a jug of wine, everything suddenly cost a fortune. The silver from the New World was making the people in the Old World poorer. Worse, why would anyone in Spain bother to make things when the country was rich enough to just buy them from somewhere else? Spain's domestic industries, its textile weavers, its blacksmiths, its farmers, withered and died. It was easier to buy cloth from the industrious Dutch or tools from the English. Spain became a nation of consumers, not producers. It was a hollow superpower, a golden shell with a rotten core. The silver acted like a narcotic. giving the empire the illusion of strength while its economic muscles atrophied. And what did the Spanish crown spend its potacy-fueled budget on? Building a better life for its people? Investing in infrastructure? Nope. It spent it on war, almost all of it. The Habsburg kings of Spain were devout Catholics, and they saw themselves as the defenders of the faith, God's bouncers on the world stage. They used the American silver to fund a series of endless, ruinously expensive wars. They fought the Protestant Dutch in the Netherlands. They fought the Protestant English at sea. They fought the Protestant princes in Germany. They fought the Ottoman Turks in the Mediterranean. They were fighting everyone, everywhere, all the time. The silver wasn't used to build Spain. It was used to bleed Spain, paying for foreign mercenaries to fight foreign wars on foreign soil. The empire was a giant gilded colander, and the wealth of the Americas just flowed right through it and into the pockets of Dutch arms dealers and German pikemen. More than once, the King of Spain, the richest man in the world, had to declare bankruptcy. So, the grand project of the Conquistadors, the brutal genocidal scramble for gold and silver, ultimately did Spain very little good. It created a temporary golden age, but it was a fever dream, one that left the patient exhausted and riddled with economic disease. They had traded a sustainable future for a short-term cash injection of epic proportions. They won the battle for the New World, but in the long run, they lost the peace. But the legacy of the Conquistadors is so much bigger than just the fate of Spain. Their chaotic, violent collision with the Americas didn't just create a colonial empire. It created the modern world, and it did so through something called the Columbian Exchange. This was the vast transatlantic transfer of plants, animals, cultures, technologies, and ideas, and of course, diseases. It was the most significant event in the history of life on Earth since the extinction of the dinosaurs. From the Americas, the Old World received foods that would revolutionize its diet and fuel a population boom. Imagine Italian food without tomatoes, Irish history without the potato, Belgian chocolate without cacao, Swiss breakfast without coffee. All of it, corn, peppers, peanuts, vanilla, came from the Americas. This new food supply allowed Europe's population to explode, providing the manpower for the Industrial Revolution and the armies of the great European empires. And what did the Americas get in return for this botanical bounty? They got horses, pigs, cattle, sheep, and goats, which completely transformed the landscape and the way of life for many native peoples. They got sugarcane, a crop that would become the engine of a new and even more horrific form of exploitation. And, as we know, they got a catastrophic cocktail of European diseases. You could call it the single worst trade deal in human history. And this brings us to the final, darkest shadow cast by the Conquistadors, the almost complete annihilation of the native population by disease and overwork created a massive labor crisis in the eyes of the colonists. Their solution was to import millions of enslaved people from Africa. The sugar plantations of Brazil and the Caribbean, the silver mines, the cotton fields, their insatiable demand for labor was met by the transatlantic slave trade. The racist ideologies that had been developed to justify the subjugation of the native peoples were now refined and applied to Africans. It was the tragic, horrifying next chapter. The conquest of the Americas laid the economic and ideological groundwork for the centuries of industrial-scale chattel slavery that would follow, creating patterns of wealth, poverty, and racial inequality that are still deeply embedded in our world today. So that's the story. It started with a handful of desperate, greedy men looking for a shortcut to glory. It ended with the creation of a new global order, the depopulation of 2 continents, the enslavement of a third, and the ultimate decline of the empire that started it all. The gold of the Aztecs is gone, melted into coins that were spent on forgotten wars. The silver of Potosi has been scattered across the globe. The great empires of the Aztecs and the Incas live on only in ruins and in the vibrant, resilient cultures of their descendants. The truth of the Conquistadors is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It's a story of human folly, of unintended consequences, of greed so profound it becomes a form of madness. It's a story of how a lust for shiny metal could reshape the biology of the entire planet and draw the blueprints for the modern world. The world we inhabit today was forged in that crucible of violence, disease, and discovery, and we are all, in some way, the heirs of both the conquerors and the conquered. Their ghosts are still with us, in the food we eat, the languages we speak, and the deep, painful questions of justice and history that we still struggle with today. The dark truth isn't that the conquistadors were monsters. The dark truth is that they were men, and that perhaps is the most terrifying lesson of all. What part of this 4-century-long catastrophe do you think has left the deepest mark on the world we live in today? The diseases, the food exchange, the flow of silver, or the legacy of slavery? Leave your final thoughts in the comments below, and thanks for taking this journey into the horrifying, absurd, and profoundly human heart of the past.